My parents pretended I was dead for 5 years. They erased me from their lives the moment I stopped fitting into their perfect suburban narrative. But the second my aunt posted a photo of my new 120-foot super yacht online, the amnesia vanished. They came kicking down my digital door demanding cash to save their failing businesses and pay their taxes. They thought they could bully me into opening my purse just like old times. What they did not realize was that I had not just moved on. I had leveled up. While they were busy demanding a handout, they had no idea I had already bought their debt. I did not just tell them no. I foreclosed on their entire existence. Before I share exactly how I turned their greed into the ultimate revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. The Miami heat hit me the second I stepped off the teak deck of the Sovereign. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon, and the saltwater breeze felt like absolute victory. I had just finished signing the final contracts in the main salon of my yacht, securing a massive international shipping logistics deal that would effectively double my company's valuation before the fourth quarter. At 35 years old, I had built an empire in luxury marine charter and tech investments. I was wearing a tailored white linen suit, shaking hands with international investors, and watching them disembark with smiles that guaranteed millions in revenue. My assistant handed me my phone, which had been set to silent during the 3-hour negotiation. The moment the screen illuminated, the device practically vibrated out of my hand. Notifications were flooding the screen faster than I could read them. It was a complete digital meltdown. I tapped the screen, squinting against the harsh Florida sun. The source of the chaos was Aunt Cheryl. My father's sister and the undisputed gossip queen of our extended family was apparently vacationing in Miami. She must have been walking along the marina when she spotted me. There on her social media feed was a high-resolution photo of me standing on the aft deck of my yacht, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking out at the skyline. The caption beneath the photo was dripping with typical family venom. "Look who somehow scammed her way onto a mega yacht. Wonder who paid for this." Cheryl had tagged my entire family. She assumed what they all would automatically assume: that a black woman like me, the family disappointment, could not possibly own a 120-foot vessel. She assumed I was a guest, a +1, or someone's temporary entertainment. Beneath the endless stream of social media alerts was a direct text message from my father. Elijah had not spoken a single word to me in half a decade. Not a birthday text, not a holiday greeting. Absolute dead silence. But seeing me on a luxury yacht was apparently enough to resurrect his parental authority. I opened the message. "Imani, we saw Cheryl's post. Your brother Malik is in a financial bind with his logistics firm, and our property taxes are due. Send 50 grand right now, or do not ever call us family again." I stood frozen on the dock, the sound of seagulls and boat engines fading into the background as I stared at those words. Send 50 grand right now. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the demand physically repulsed me. They threw me out like garbage when I was 30 years old. My first software startup had hit a major financial wall, and I had asked for a temporary place to stay while I pivoted the business model. Elijah had literally thrown my suitcase into the pouring rain, calling my tech ambitions a complete delusion. He told me I was a worthless failure who embarrassed the family name. My mother had stood right next to him on the porch, coldly stating that her only successful child was my brother Malik, the corporate golden boy who always did exactly what they wanted. They had slammed the door in my face, leaving me stranded with nothing but my laptop and a few clothes. For 5 years, I ground out 18-hour days. I slept in a rented storage unit. I bootstrapped my coding skills into a proprietary maritime logistics software that revolutionized the industry. I built wealth they could not even comprehend. I did not ask for a single dime from them during those brutal years. When I was eating instant noodles and showering at a cheap local gym, my family was attending country club dinners and bragging about Malik's new suburban mansion. They deliberately excluded me from weddings, funerals, and family reunions. I was the cautionary tale they used to scare their friends' children. Look what happens when you do not follow the rules, they would say. Look what happens when you refuse to be a respectable employee and chase foolish dreams instead. Now, 5 years later, the golden child was apparently drowning in debt. Malik's traditional corporate logistics firm was clearly failing, and my parents were unable to pay the property taxes on the massive house they bought just to show off to their church friends. The irony was so thick it practically choked me. They wanted $50,000. They demanded it as a right of blood, tossing out the threat of disownment as if they had not already executed that exact threat 5 years prior. They truly believed the threat of losing their love would bring me to my knees. I looked back at the sleek, towering profile of the sovereign. I had paid for this vessel in cash. I employed a full-time crew of 8. I controlled international shipping lanes. I was no longer the desperate broke 30-year-old crying on their porch in the rain. I was a titan in my industry. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. They really thought I was just visiting someone else's wealth. They thought a simple text message would make me empty my accounts out of desperate longing for their approval. I tapped my screen, preparing to forward the text to my wealth management team to investigate exactly how deep Malik's financial ruin went. Before I could even type a single letter, the screen shifted. The phone began to ring loudly in my hand. The caller ID flashed in bright, demanding letters. It was Beverly, my mother. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear without saying a single word. I did not need to. The second the line connected, the shrill, frantic sound of my mother's voice shattered the 5 years of dead air between us. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if the towering super yacht in the viral photograph actually belonged to me or if I was simply standing in front of it. Imani Taylor, you need to text me your accountant's direct routing number right this second. Her voice carried the exact same demanding, entitled pitch she used when I was a teenager failing to clean the kitchen fast enough to her liking. It was a tone designed to strip away my autonomy and reduce me to a subordinate. I leaned back against the polished teak railing of my ship, feeling the warm Miami breeze against my face, and let her sharp breathing fill the silence. I asked her who was calling. "Do not play games with me, little girl." Beverly snapped, her voice echoing loudly enough that my deckhand paused his polishing a few feet away. "This is your mother. Stop acting foolish and get me those numbers. Your brother is sick with stress. He is having actual palpitations. Malik needs $50,000 wired before the banks close today, so his payroll does not bounce, and your father and I need our property taxes covered." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The ice clinked against the crystal glass. I told her she must have the wrong number because my mother made it explicitly clear 5 years ago on a freezing rain-soaked Tuesday that she only had one daughter and her name was Shanice. I reminded her that she stood on the front porch of her heavily mortgaged suburban house, watched my father hurl my single suitcase into a puddle, and told me that I was a deadweight failure who embarrassed the family name. Beverly scoffed loudly into the receiver, dismissing my trauma with a sharp click of her tongue. "That was tough love, Imani. You were 30 years old, sleeping in our spare room, playing around with some delusional computer hobby instead of getting a real job like your brother. We had to push you out of the nest so you would learn how the real world works. And clearly it worked. Look at you now, flaunting your wealth all over the internet while your own flesh and blood is suffering. You should be thanking us." The sheer, unadulterated gaslighting was staggering. I did not thank them. I survived in spite of them. I reminded her exactly how her brand of tough love felt. I asked her if she remembered the 6 months I spent sleeping on an inflatable mattress inside a 10 by 10 climate-controlled storage unit off Interstate 85. I asked her if she remembered when I called her, begging for a $50 grocery store gift card so I could eat something other than dry cereal while I debugged the logistics software that eventually made me a multimillionaire. "I remember what you said to me that day, Beverly." I kept my voice dangerously calm, refusing to give her the hysterical screaming match she was trying to provoke. "You told me that my poverty was a punishment from God for not submitting to my parents' wisdom. You told me to go to a homeless shelter because the Taylor family did not fund lost causes. You are holding on to ancient history, Beverly shouted, her panic bleeding through her aggressive facade. Family is family, Imani. The Bible says, honor your father and mother. We sacrificed the best years of our lives to put clothes on your back and food in your stomach. You owe us. Malik is going to lose his logistics firm. Do you understand what that means? He is the pride of this family. His company is a pillar of the community. I laughed then, a sharp, cold sound that caught her off guard. I told her I knew exactly what kind of pillar Malik was. I knew his traditional corporate logistics firm was operating on an outdated business model with bloated executive salaries because he spent more time trying to look wealthy on social media than actually managing his supply chains. Malik was the golden boy who was handed a down payment for his 5-bedroom house by the same parents who locked me out in the rain. That is not your business, Beverly shrieked, her breathing becoming ragged. Your business is stepping up and doing your duty as a black daughter. You have a yacht, Imani. A yacht. Do you know how embarrassed we were when Cheryl posted that picture and we had to find out from a Facebook post that our daughter is rich? We looked like fools. I told her she looked like a fool because she was one. I informed her that my wealth was not a communal family pot she could dip her hands into whenever her golden child mismanaged his ledgers. My purse was closed. It was permanently sealed shut to the people who watched me starve and felt nothing but self-righteous satisfaction. If you do not send this money right now, your father will never forgive you, she threatened, dropping her voice into a vicious, menacing register. He will disown you permanently. You will have no family left. You will be alone on that boat with your money and absolutely no one who loves you. I smiled, watching a pair of dolphins dive through the wake of a passing speedboat. I told her Elijah's forgiveness had absolutely zero currency in my world. I traded in international shipping routes, corporate acquisitions, and distressed debt. Toxic parental approval was a worthless asset class, and I was no longer accepting it as collateral. I told her to tell Malik to sell his designer watches and figure out his own payroll, and I advised her and Elijah to downsize their house if they could not afford the taxes. Imani, listen to me right now. Beverly's voice hit a frantic, hysterical pitch. The bank is threatening us. We are drowning. You cannot just sit there on your millions and watch us lose everything. We are your blood. Before I could tell her that my blood was the only thing I shared with her, the audio on the other end of the line shifted violently. There was a loud scuffling sound, the noise of a phone being forcibly snatched from someone's grip, and Beverly giving a startled gasp. Give me the phone, Beverly. She is clearly not listening to reason, a male voice demanded in the background. The voice that came through the speaker next was nasal, overly confident, and dripping with the kind of unearned aggressive authority that instantly made my skin crawl. It was Chad, my sister Shanice's white husband. The man who had bankrupted 2 contracting businesses and constantly spoke to the black members of my family as if he were our self-appointed patriarch and financial savior. Listen here, Imani. Chad said, his tone thick with condescension, as if he were scolding a toddler who refused to share her toys. You need to drop this angry black woman attitude and start thinking about the bigger picture. You got lucky finding some rich guy to fund your lifestyle, but real wealth is about family legacy, and it is time for you to do what you are told. I gripped the polished teak railing of my yacht so tightly my knuckles turned ash gray against my skin. Chad actually believed he held authority over me. A man whose entire business model consisted of buying dilapidated properties, slapping down cheap laminate flooring, and overcharging young families. He had bankrupted 2 contracting businesses, yet he had the absolute nerve to speak to me about wealth and legacy. He did not stop to take a breath. He just kept talking, his voice dripping with the unearned confidence of a mediocre white man who married into a black family and decided he was our financial savior. Shanice and I have been carrying your parents financially, he lied smoothly. Do you have any idea the burden that places on my real estate portfolio? I am dealing with high-level institutional lenders, Imani. My capital is tied up in development projects that are revitalizing entire neighborhoods. I cannot keep liquidating my assets to cover Malik and your parents because you decided to run off and play pretend in Miami. I listened to the squawk of seagulls circling the marina. I let his words wash over me without interrupting. I wanted him to feel powerful. I wanted him to expose exactly how deep his delusion went. He talked about his high-level institutional lenders. I knew for a fact he was relying on predatory hard money loans with astronomical interest rates. He talked about revitalizing neighborhoods, but his public records showed a trail of code violations, unpaid contractors, and desperate attempts to refinance properties that were bleeding cash. He was a fraud wrapped in a cheap suit, but my parents worshipped the ground he walked on simply because he was not me. He took my silence as submission. "It is time for you to pull your weight," he commanded. I saw the pictures Cheryl posted. "You clearly found yourself a sugar daddy with deep pockets. Do not get me wrong, good for you for securing a bag. We all know you struggled after your little tech business went under. But you need to use your current situation to your family's advantage. Go bat your eyelashes at whoever owns that boat and tell him you need a low-interest loan to invest in a guaranteed real estate venture." The sheer audacity of his assumption hung in the humid Florida air. He was entirely convinced that a black woman could not possibly own a vessel that required an 8-person crew and a multi-million-dollar operating budget. He looked at a photograph of me standing on a luxury yacht and immediately reduced me to a transactional companion. He thought I was just arm candy occupying space on a rich man's playground. I did not correct him. I did not tell him that the yacht was registered to my offshore holding company. I did not tell him that I was the one securing global shipping routes and negotiating 9-figure logistics contracts. I let him dig his grave with his own tongue. "You tell your guy it is for a diversified property portfolio in Atlanta." Chad continued, his tone shifting into what he clearly thought was a persuasive business pitch. Chad actually believed he was imparting financial wisdom. He spoke with the rhythm of a man who watched too many motivational business videos online, but lacked the fundamental intelligence to execute a single successful strategy. Tell him he is getting in on the ground floor with a developer who has a proven track record. "Your parents respect me because I know how money works, Imani. I stepped up when you stepped out. So now it is your turn to show some gratitude." I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping away every ounce of emotion. "How much do you need, Chad?" He let out a sharp breath, a sound of smug satisfaction. Finally, someone talking sense. He cleared his throat, slipping into his best imitation of a Wall Street executive. "To stabilize my current flips and cover Malik's payroll shortage, we are looking at $300,000. Honestly, it is a drop in the bucket for a guy who can afford a 100-foot boat. $300,000. The exact number made a cold smile spread across my face. I knew why he needed that specific amount. I knew his lenders. I knew his default notices. I knew the intimate, terrifying details of his impending financial ruin. But he thought he was playing me. He thought he was playing the rich phantom boyfriend he had invented in his mind. "Just get the cash wired to my corporate account by Friday," Chad instructed casually, as if he were ordering a coffee. "I will even draw up a promissory note so your boyfriend feels secure about his investment. I will put your parents down as guarantors, just to keep everything in the family. We are family, Imani. This is what families do. They consolidate resources to protect their own. You just need to do exactly what I tell you, and I will make sure your parents forgive you for your past mistakes. We can even fly you down for Thanksgiving if you behave. All you have to do is send the routing numbers right now and we can—" I pressed the red button on my screen. The line went completely dead. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer an explanation. I did not defend my honor or explain my wealth. I simply cut him off right in the middle of his arrogant, self-serving monologue. I lowered the phone, staring out at the crystal-clear water of the Atlantic Ocean. The sheer silence was beautiful. I took a deep breath of the salt air, feeling the immense, untouchable power of my own independence. I had cut the cord. I pictured the scene in my parents' living room. Chad staring at his phone in disbelief, his face turning an angry shade of red. My mother gasping at the sheer audacity of my hanging up on her son-in-law. I could imagine the chaos erupting in their heavily mortgaged house. They were so accustomed to my compliance, so used to beating me down with their words, that a simple dial tone was enough to shatter their fragile authority. But I knew the silence would not last. The Taylor family did not handle rejection well, and they handled disrespect even worse. To them, my boundary was a declaration of war. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Exactly 30 seconds later, my phone vibrated so violently it nearly slipped from my hand. The screen illuminated with Malik's contact photo. He was calling back to back, the digital desperation evident in the rapid-fire notifications flashing across my display. I watched the screen light up repeatedly, refusing to answer. I let the phone ring until it finally stopped, immediately followed by the notification of a new voicemail. I tapped the audio icon, raising the phone back to my ear to hear my brother's frantic, venomous voice. I tapped the audio icon and lifted the phone to my ear as my heels clicked against the teakwood ramp of the Sovereign. The Miami sun was beating down on my shoulders, warm and golden, wrapping me in the kind of physical comfort that only comes from absolute financial security. But the voice filtering through the speaker was cold, frantic, and dripping with the exact same unearned arrogance that had suffocated me for 3 decades. It was Malik. My older brother did not bother with a greeting. He skipped right past any pretense of familial affection and dove straight into the demands. Imani, I know you just hung up on Chad, but you are not going to disrespect me. His voice barked through the tiny speaker. You are going to listen very closely. My corporate logistics firm is hitting a temporary cash flow snag. The market is shifting, and I need 50,000 wired by the close of business today to cover my executive payroll and keep my fleet moving. Chad already told you the deal. Do not make me come down to Miami and embarrass you in front of whoever is paying for that boat. You owe this family. If you do not send the routing numbers right now, I will contact my lawyers and sue you for family equity. We funded your life for 30 years, and I am legally entitled to a return on that investment. I stopped walking right at the top of the ramp. I let the sheer magnificent absurdity of his words wash over me. Family equity. He had actually strung those two words together and threatened me with them. There was no such legal concept. There was no court in the United States that would grant a 37-year-old man a percentage of my offshore holding companies simply because we shared the same parents. But Malik truly believed it. He had been the golden child for so long, the brilliant son who did everything right, that he genuinely believed the universe, and my bank accounts belonged to him by divine right. Hearing his voice crack with panic over his failing business triggered a memory so visceral I could almost smell the wet asphalt. 5 years ago, I was not standing in the Miami sunshine. I was standing on the front porch of our family home in Atlanta, in the middle of a torrential November downpour. My first startup had collapsed, draining my savings, and I had nowhere else to go. Elijah had dragged my single heavy suitcase out the front door and hurled it directly into a muddy puddle on the driveway. He told me I was a disgrace. Beverly stood behind him, her arms crossed tight against her chest, nodding in agreement, as she told me I had brought this ruin upon myself by refusing to find a normal husband and a normal job. But it was Malik who twisted the knife. I remembered him leaning against the doorframe, wearing a tailored navy blue suit from his brand-new corporate director job. He was holding a designer coffee mug completely shielded from the freezing rain that was soaking through my thin jacket. He looked at me, a sister who had just lost everything, and he laughed. It was a soft, pitying chuckle that echoed louder than the thunder. You think some maritime software code is going to make you rich? He had mocked me, taking a slow sip of his coffee. You are delusional, Imani. You are playing on a computer while the real men are running the world. Get a real job or get off our porch. You are embarrassing the Taylor name. The memory faded, replaced by the gentle rocking of my super yacht beneath my feet. I handed my sunglasses to one of my uniformed crew members and stepped into the air-conditioned main salon. Malik was right about one thing 5 years ago. I was playing on a computer. And that computer code had completely revolutionized international freight tracking. It had streamlined supply chains for the largest shipping conglomerates on the planet. I had built a tech empire, while Malik had stubbornly clung to an outdated traditional logistics model. He had bloated his company with massive executive salaries, leased a fleet of gas-guzzling trucks, and refused to innovate. Now his archaic business was bleeding cash, and the golden boy was drowning. The real man running the world was begging the delusional sister for a lifeline. The voicemail ended with a sharp, angry click. I did not delete the message. I saved it to a secure folder, filing it away as evidence of his crumbling mental state. I was just about to lock my screen and pour myself a celebratory glass of sparkling water when a new notification dropped down from the top banner of my phone. It was not a text message or a missed call. It was a social media alert. Aunt Cheryl had just gone live on her public profile, and she had tagged my personal account, my parents Malik, Shanice, and 20 other extended family members. I tapped the notification, feeling a strange, dark curiosity. The screen loaded, revealing Aunt Cheryl sitting in what looked like a brightly lit Miami hotel cafe. Her face was pressed close to the camera, her expression contorted into a mask of theatrical, exaggerated grief. She was speaking directly to her audience, which was already climbing past 100 viewers, mostly composed of our church community and distant relatives who thrived on Taylor family drama. "Family, we need to bow our heads and pray for Imani right now," Cheryl announced to the camera, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. "I am down here in Miami, and the Lord just showed me a terrible truth. I just saw my niece stepping off a mega yacht draped in designer clothes, living like a billionaire. And yet I am sitting here getting phone calls from my brother Elijah, telling me the bank is about to take his house. Imani is hoarding wealth, parading around on a boat paid for by strangers while her own mother and father are on the brink of being put out on the street. She has forgotten where she came from. She has turned her back on her blood." I watched the screen in absolute fascination as the comments section began to scroll wildly. Cousins I had not spoken to since high school were typing out their shock and disgust. Uncles who had never once offered me a dime when I was sleeping in a storage unit were suddenly posting angry emojis and demanding to know how I could be so selfish. Aunt Cheryl leaned closer to the lens, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "She is letting a white man like Chad try to save our family legacy while she sits on an ocean of cash. We need to hold her accountable." The broadcast was a masterclass in manipulation. Cheryl was twisting the narrative, weaponizing my success to paint me as the greedy villain, while elevating my financially reckless parents into helpless victims. The family group chat, which had been dormant for half a decade, suddenly exploded to life. My screen filled with a chaotic barrage of venomous messages, demands for explanations, and outright threats from people who felt entirely entitled to the empire I had built from the mud. The ambush had officially begun. I watched the screen of my phone with absolute fascination as Aunt Cheryl continued her live broadcast. She was sitting in a brightly lit Miami hotel cafe with a faux marble table behind her, wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors to maximize the drama. She pressed her face close to the camera, her expression contorted into a mask of theatrical, exaggerated grief. She was speaking directly to her audience, which was already climbing past 200 viewers, mostly composed of our church community back in Atlanta and distant relatives who thrived on Taylor family drama. "Family, we need to bow our heads and pray for Imani right now," Cheryl announced to the camera, placing a manicured hand dramatically over her heart. "I am down here in Miami, and the Lord just showed me a terrible truth. I just saw my niece stepping off a mega yacht draped in white linen, living like a billionaire. And yet, I am sitting here getting phone calls from my brother Elijah, telling me the bank is about to take his house. Imani is hoarding wealth, parading around on a boat paid for by some secret man, while her own mother and father are on the brink of being put out on the street. She has forgotten where she came from. She has turned her back on her blood." The broadcast was a masterclass in manipulation. Cheryl was twisting the narrative, weaponizing my success to paint me as the greedy villain while elevating my financially reckless parents into helpless victims. She knew exactly what buttons to push to rally the community against me. Within seconds, the family group chat, a thread I had muted and ignored for half a decade, suddenly exploded to life. my screen filled with a chaotic barrage of venomous messages, demands for explanations, and outright threats from people who felt entirely entitled to the empire I had built from the mud. My phone vibrated so intensely it felt hot in my palm, the notifications stacked up like a digital firing squad. Cousin Tyrell, a man who was currently 32 years old and still asking his mother to pay his cell phone bill while he pursued a non-existent rap career, was the first to chime in. He typed in all caps calling me a sellout and demanding to know why I had not invested in his record label if I was out here living like royalty. Then came Uncle Vernon, the family's self-appointed moral compass, typing paragraphs about how a black woman owes her success to the village that raised her, conveniently forgetting that his contribution to my village was telling me my software startup was a waste of time and refusing to loan me $200 for groceries. Shanice, my older sister, quickly took the stage in the chat. She played the long-suffering victim perfectly. She typed out a massive block of text detailing how stressed her husband Chad was, how they were trying to hold the family together, and how incredibly selfish it was for me to hide a sugar daddy with a yacht while Malik was struggling to keep his logistics company afloat. She accused me of turning my back on the people who wiped my tears, ignoring the fact that the only people who wiped my tears 5 years ago were the gym attendants who handed me towels when I lived out of my car. They were all feeding off each other's outrage in real time. The chat became an echo chamber of entitlement. Aunt Denise chimed in to say my mother Beverly was practically crying blood over my disrespect. They demanded I wire the $50,000 Malik needed immediately to prove I still had a soul. They commanded me to send Chad the capital he required for his real estate flips to show I respected the family hierarchy. They truly believed they could shame me into submission. They thought the threat of public embarrassment would force me to open my accounts just to make the noise stop. I did not cry. I did not feel a single ounce of shame. I did not type out a defensive emotional paragraph explaining that I owned the yacht, that there was no sugar daddy, and that I had built a multinational tech and shipping conglomerate with my own 2 hands. Arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you is a poverty mindset. I was a CEO and I handled threats like a corporate entity under hostile attack. I calmly took a screenshot of Aunt Cheryl's live stream. I screen recorded the entire family group chat, capturing every single demanding, toxic, defamatory message they posted. I opened my encrypted corporate email application and drafted a message to my lead counsel and my wealth management team in Atlanta. I attached the screenshots and the video file. My instructions were precise and entirely devoid of emotion. I directed my financial analysts to run a comprehensive deep dive asset check on every single relative currently demanding money in the group chat. I wanted full diagnostic reports on their credit scores, their outstanding liabilities, their property liens, and their corporate tax statuses. I wanted to know exactly who they owed money to, how long they had been in default, and the precise legal structure of Chad's failing real estate LLC and Malik's sinking logistics firm. I was not going to walk into a battle blind. I was going to map out the exact dimensions of their financial ruin before I ever looked them in the eye. I hit send on the email, feeling the satisfying finality of the action. My team was ruthless and efficient. By Monday morning, I would have a dossier thick enough to bury every single one of them under the weight of their own hypocrisy. I returned to the group chat. They were still spiraling, working themselves into a frenzy because I had not responded. Tyrell was calling me a coward. Shanice was typing that my silence proved I was guilty and ashamed of how I was funding my lifestyle. They thought they had me cornered. They thought the girl they threw away 5 years ago was hiding behind a phone screen, terrified of their judgment. I tapped the text box. I did not type an explanation. I did not defend my honor. I did not explain that I was the creditor holding the keys to their survival. I simply gave them an address and a mandate. My thumbs moved quickly across the screen, drafting the only response they were ever going to get from me. If you want to discuss my finances, come to my corporate headquarters in Atlanta on Monday morning. Bring your ledgers. I hit send. I watched the message appear at the very bottom of the chaotic thread. The impact was instantaneous. The rapid-fire barrage of text bubbles abruptly halted. The typing indicators from Shanice Tyrell and Aunt Cheryl vanished. The absolute deafening silence that fell over the digital chat was the sweetest sound I had heard all day. I locked my phone, slipped it into my pocket, and turned back to the ocean. They wanted a family meeting, and I was going to give them a corporate execution. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear skies that made the Atlanta skyline look like it was carved from glass. I sat behind my custom marble desk in the penthouse suite of my corporate headquarters. The building was a towering monument to the empire I had built from absolute zero. I owned the top 3 floors entirely. The lower levels were leased out to boutique law firms and international shipping conglomerates. The silence in my office was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system and the rustle of the thick, heavy paper I was currently turning over in my hands. My wealth management team and lead counsel had worked through the weekend exactly as I had instructed. They had delivered a comprehensive, meticulously documented dossier on the financial reality of the Taylor family. The papers spread across my desk were nothing short of a financial autopsy. The data was cold, undeniable, and utterly devastating. Malik was not just experiencing a temporary cash flow snag as he had claimed in his frantic voicemail. His corporate logistics firm was operating on fumes. He was 90 days delinquent on his primary warehouse leases, his fleet of trucks was facing imminent repossession, and he had completely drained his employee payroll accounts to maintain his flashy lifestyle. Shanice and Chad were in even worse shape. Chad's real estate flipping business was a house of cards built on predatory, high-interest, hard money loans. He was currently facing 3 separate lawsuits from unpaid contractors, and his LLC was effectively bankrupt. But the most damning documents belonged to Elijah and Beverly. My parents had leveraged everything they owned to keep up appearances and fund the failures of their golden children. They had taken out a 3rd mortgage on their sprawling suburban home at an astronomical 20% interest rate. They had used Elijah's primary commercial real estate holdings as collateral for Chad's disastrous property developments. They were in default across the board. They were not just struggling, they were weeks away from total irreversible ruin. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, feeling a chilling sense of calm wash over me. 5 years ago, they had thrown me into the rain because they believed I was a financial liability. Now I was staring at the undeniable proof that their entire existence was built on borrowed money and desperate lies. The soft chime of my private intercom interrupted the silence. I pressed the button on my console. It was Jackson, my head of corporate security. He had been with me for 3 years, a former military police officer who handled my building's safety with absolute precision. His voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying tension of a man dealing with a highly irregular situation. Ms. Taylor, Jackson said calmly, "I apologize for the interruption, but we have a hostile situation developing in the main lobby." A group of 5 individuals bypassed the visitor registration protocol. They are refusing to provide identification or wait for an appointment. They are currently causing a significant disturbance and demanding immediate access to the executive floors. They claim they are your family. I did not flinch. I did not feel a spike of anxiety or the old familiar dread that used to accompany any interaction with my parents. I felt nothing but the predatory anticipation of a trap finally snapping shut. I instructed Jackson to hold them in the lobby and keep the security feed active. I tapped the control panel on my desk, bringing up the live high-definition security camera footage from the ground floor on my massive wall monitor. The visual was spectacular in its pathetic nature. There they were standing in the center of my sprawling, marble-floored atrium. Elijah, Beverly, Malik, Shanice, and Chad. They had clearly driven straight from their heavily mortgaged suburban homes, fully intending to ambush me, embarrass me, and drag me to a bank. I watched their body language closely. It told a story of profound cognitive dissonance. They had arrived expecting to find me working out of a rented desk in a shared co-working space. They had expected to barge through a flimsy door, yell at a receptionist, and corner me in a tiny cubicle. Instead, they had walked into a fortress of wealth. The sheer scale of my multi-level corporate headquarters had clearly rattled them. The 50-foot ceilings, the indoor waterfalls, the armed security guards in tailored suits, and the massive backlit brushed steel logo of my company on the wall had shattered their entire narrative. But the Taylor family did not know how to process humility. If they admitted the reality of my power, they would have to admit the reality of their own failure. So instead of showing respect or awe, they chose to double down on their aggression to mask their overwhelming insecurity. On the screen, Elijah was red in the face. He was leaning heavily over the curved reception desk, pointing his finger aggressively at my front desk staff. He was attempting to use the same loud, booming authority he used to bully me when I was a teenager, completely ignoring the fact that the women behind the desk were highly trained corporate professionals who were entirely unbothered by his temper tantrum. Beverly was pacing in tight circles behind him, clutching her knockoff designer purse against her chest. She was glaring at the sleek, minimalist architecture of the lobby, as if the building itself had deeply insulted her, performing her outrage for anyone who would look. Malik looked physically ill. He was sweating in his off-the-rack suit, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His eyes kept darting toward the ceiling, taking in the scale of the operation. He was a man who ran a failing logistics company out of a cheap strip mall, and he was currently standing in the lobby of an empire that eclipsed his wildest dreams. The reality of how badly he had underestimated the sister he threw away was clearly suffocating him. Shanice was standing safely behind her husband, playing the role of the delicate, overwhelmed wife. And then there was Chad. Chad was stepping up to the lead security guards, puffing out his chest. I watched the white brother-in-law syndrome take complete control of his actions. He was a man who had bankrupted multiple businesses, currently drowning in debt, yet he operated with an unearned, aggressive entitlement. He was a white man standing in a black woman's corporate empire, and he truly believed his presence granted him instant, unquestionable executive authority. He assumed he inherently possessed more power than the uniformed guards blocking his path to the elevators. I watched him jab his finger into Jackson's personal space. I did not need audio to know exactly what kind of threats were spilling out of his mouth. He was trying to assert dominance in a room where he held absolutely zero leverage. I stood up from my desk. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, picking up the financial dossier and sliding it neatly into a leather portfolio. I did not rush. I walked across the plush carpet of my office toward the private executive elevator. I pressed the call button, stepping into the glass carriage as the doors slid open. The descent was smooth and silent. Because the elevator was encased in glass and positioned in the center of the building's architectural core, I could see the entire atrium as I glided downward. I watched the chaos from above. They looked so small down there. They were tiny, chaotic figures, desperately clinging to a family hierarchy that no longer existed. They were trying to enforce rules in a kingdom where I was the only sovereign. As the elevator reached the ground floor, the thick glass dampened the ambient noise of the building, but it could not block out the shouting. The doors began to slide open silently, and the sound of the lobby flooded into the carriage. Chad's voice rang out clearly, echoing off the marble floors and the high ceilings. He was standing inches away from Jackson, his face twisted in an ugly sneer. "You people clearly do not understand who you are dealing with," Chad shouted, his voice dripping with condescension. "You work for my sister-in-law, which means you work for me. I am family. I will have your badge and your job by the end of the day if you do not step aside and let us up those elevators right now." I stepped out of the glass elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The sharp click of my heels against the imported Italian marble floor echoed through the sprawling atrium like a gavel striking a sound block. The chaotic shouting instantly died in my throat as Chad spun around to face me. His face was flushed a mottled, angry red, his jaw tight with the sheer indignation of being told no by a black man in a tailored security suit. Before he could unleash whatever threat he had queued up, Elijah shoved past him. My father was a tall, broad-shouldered man who had spent his entire life using his physical presence to intimidate anyone who disagreed with him. For 30 years, his booming baritone voice had been the terrifying soundtrack of my submission. He marched across the lobby floor, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. He was treating my corporate headquarters like it was his own suburban living room, firmly believing that he could simply yell me into compliance. "Imani Taylor, you tell these a cops to stand down, right this second," Elijah roared, projecting his voice so it bounced off the 50-foot glass ceilings. His face was twisted in a familiar mask of patriarchal rage. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face, a gesture designed to shame me in front of my own employees. "You are making a fool of this family. I demand you fire this man immediately for disrespecting your sister's husband." He stopped mere inches from me, looming over my personal space in an overt display of physical intimidation. 5 years ago, when he dragged me by my collar to the front door and threw me into the freezing rain, I would have cowered. I would have shrunk myself down, apologized, and scrambled to fix whatever imaginary slight I had committed. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my posture perfectly straight. My hands relaxed at my sides and met his furious gaze with eyes entirely devoid of fear. I turned my head slightly, looking past his pointing finger, and addressed my head of security. "Jackson, your team handled this security breach flawlessly," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly across the quiet lobby. "I am adding a $10,000 bonus to your next paycheck for maintaining absolute professionalism in the face of unprovoked hostility." Elijah visibly choked on his next breath. The sheer, unbothered dismissal of his authority hit him like a physical blow. He lunged forward, grabbing my upper arm. It was a visceral, violent reflex, the exact same way he used to grab me when I failed to meet his suffocating expectations. "Remove your hand from my body, Elijah," I commanded. I did not yell. I did not raise my pitch. I dropped my voice into the cold, flat register of a chief executive officer addressing a trespassing vagrant. "I am no longer a broke 30-year-old sleeping on a storage facility floor begging for your approval. I own this building. I own the ground you are standing on. If you do not release my arm in the next 2 seconds, Jackson and his armed team will tackle you to this marble floor, and you will leave my property in handcuffs." Elijah snatched his hand back as if my blazer had suddenly caught fire. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, jarring realization that physical intimidation was a completely useless currency in my world. "How dare you speak to your father that way?" Beverly shrieked, rushing forward to flank her husband. She clutched her counterfeit designer bag to her chest, playing the role of the wounded matriarch to perfection. "We raised you. We fed you. We taught you respect. You are going to take us up to your office right now and write your brother a check. Malik is missing payroll because you are down in Miami acting like a harlot instead of doing your duty to this family." I looked at Beverly, scanning her outdated suit and the desperate, frantic energy vibrating off her frame. "You did not raise me, Beverly. You raised Shanice. You tolerated me until my tech startup hit a rough patch, and then you evicted me to keep your country club image completely spotless. You told me I was dead to you, so consider this a conversation with a ghost." Malik finally stepped out from behind our parents. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. The golden child was cracking under the pressure of his failing traditional logistics firm. "Come on," Imani Malik stammered, trying to inject a tone of pragmatic business negotiation into a situation where he held zero leverage. "Let us just go up to your little office and sort this out. I need 50 grand to cover my trucks. Chad needs capital for his flips. We are family. Stop making a scene in front of your receptionist and act like a professional." I glanced at Malik's frayed shirt cuffs. I noticed the cheap off-brand watch he was wearing because he had clearly pawned his Rolex to keep his creditors at bay. He still thought he was superior to me. Even while begging for his financial life, he referred to my multinational corporate empire as a little office. I stepped back, creating a clear physical boundary between myself and the chaotic mass of my relatives. "I'm going to make this incredibly simple for all of you," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the lobby. "You bypassed my security protocol. You verbally assaulted my staff. You walked into my territory demanding money that you have absolutely no right to claim. You have exactly 2 choices right now." I gestured toward the revolving glass doors at the front of the building. You can turn around, walk out those doors, get back in your heavily financed vehicles, and never speak my name again. If you choose that option, I will instruct Jackson to let you leave without calling the Atlanta police." I then gestured toward the frosted glass doors of my private executive elevator. "Or since you so graciously brought your ledgers and demanded a family meeting, you can step into that elevator with me. We will go up to my penthouse boardroom. We will lay your financial demands on my mahogany table, and we will discuss exactly what you think I owe you." The five of them stood frozen in the center of the atrium. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that they were entirely disoriented. Elijah's shoulders slumped a fraction of an inch. Beverly looked terrified but too greedy to walk away from the promise of a check. Malik was desperate, practically vibrating with the need to secure his $50,000. They looked at the elevator like it was a lifeline, completely unaware that it was a trap door leading to their absolute ruin. Chad, however, was fuming. The white brother-in-law syndrome had hit a brick wall. His entire worldview was built on the assumption that his presence commanded instant compliance, particularly from black women. He could not handle the fact that I had neutralized his aggression, dismissed his threats, and taken total control of the room without breaking a sweat. He adjusted his poorly tailored jacket, his face twisted in a sneer of pure venomous entitlement. He stepped close to Shanice, but he spoke loud enough for my ears. "Somebody needs to teach this arrogant girl her place." The racist microaggression hung in the air, sharp and ugly. He thought his quiet muttering would intimidate me. He thought reminding me of the social hierarchy he believed in would rattle my confidence. I slowly pivoted on my heels, focusing my entire attention solely on Chad. I did not blink. I locked eyes with him, letting the absolute crushing weight of my power settle over his mediocre existence. "Step into my elevator, Chad," I promised, my voice dropping into a register so dark and cold it made Malik physically flinch. "Step into my boardroom. I am going to teach you exactly what my place is." The glass doors of the executive elevator slid shut, sealing the six of us inside a silent and frictionless carriage. The chaotic noise of the lobby instantly vanished, replaced by the faint and rhythmic hum of the ascent. As we shot upward toward the penthouse level, the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline expanded around us. The city stretched out in a sprawling grid of glass and steel, a visual representation of power and capital. I stood near the front of the carriage, my posture perfectly straight, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I did not look back at them. I let the intimidating silence do the heavy lifting. Behind me, the shifting of weight and nervous breathing filled the enclosed space. I could see their reflections in the polished glass of the elevator doors. Malik was sweating profusely. He kept pulling at the collar of his cheap off-the-rack suit, trying to loosen a tie that was already crooked. The digital floor indicator ticked higher and higher, and with every passing floor, the reality of my net worth seemed to physically crush the oxygen out of his lungs. He was a man drowning in corporate debt, and he was currently locked in a glass box with the sister he had mocked for pursuing a tech delusion. Chad stood stiffly next to Shanice, his arms crossed tight against his chest. His jaw was clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. He was furious that he had lost control of the narrative in the lobby, but he was completely out of his depth. He was used to bullying unpaid contractors and desperate homeowners. He had absolutely no framework for dealing with a black woman who held unquestionable executive authority over an entire high-rise building. The elevator chimed softly as we reached the top floor. The doors parted to reveal my private boardroom. It was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed and vertigo-inducing view of the city. A massive custom-built mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. Two of my private security personnel stood by the double doors at the far end, their expressions carefully neutral, but their presence undeniably absolute. I stepped out of the elevator and walked directly to the head of the table. I did not invite them to sit. I let them hover awkwardly near the entrance, forcing them to take in the sheer scale of the wealth they had just demanded a piece of. Elijah stepped out first, attempting to mask his overwhelming awe with a dismissive scoff. He looked around the room, taking in the original artwork and the sleek technology integrated into the walls, but the bravado he tried to project fell entirely flat. His broad shoulders sagged just a fraction. He was realizing that he could not yell his way into a wire transfer here. Beverly, ever the chameleon, instantly realized that outright aggression was a losing strategy. I watched her calculation happen in real time. If she could not command me as a disobedient child, she would try to manipulate me as a loving mother. She smoothed the front of her outdated dress and took a slow, deliberate step toward me. She plastered on a wide and trembling smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Imani, this is just incredible," Beverly cooed, pitching her voice to sound soft and overwhelmed with maternal pride. She walked closer, her hands fluttering in front of her like nervous birds. "Look at what you have built. I am just so amazed. You know I always told your father that you were going to do something big with those computers. I always knew you had a special gift." The sheer audacity of her historical revisionism was staggering. She was actively trying to rewrite our entire past, to position herself as the supportive architect of my success. She reached out, extending her hand to touch my arm, attempting to establish a physical connection that she could leverage into an emotional surrender. I took one sharp and deliberate step backward. The physical boundary I drew was so sudden and absolute that her hand hung suspended in the empty air between us. "Do not touch me, Beverly," I commanded. My voice was low, carrying no anger, only the freezing and impenetrable chill of a closed door. "Do not stand in my boardroom and attempt to rewrite history because you are suddenly impressed by the view." Beverly gasped, clutching her hand to her chest, as if I had physically struck her. "Imani, how can you be so cold?" she whispered, her eyes darting around the room to ensure the others were witnessing my supposed cruelty. "I am your mother. I am just trying to tell you how proud I am." I leaned forward, planting my hands flat on the polished mahogany table. "You are not proud of me, Beverly. You are intimidated by my tax bracket, and you are terrified that you have lost your leverage." I locked eyes with her, refusing to let her look away. "5 years ago, I stood on your front porch with a single suitcase while the rain soaked through my clothes. I begged you for a week on your couch just so I could fix the software code that built this entire empire. Do you remember what you said to me?" Beverly swallowed hard. Her eyes darted frantically toward Elijah, seeking a rescue that was not going to come. "We were just trying to teach you responsibility," she stammered. "We wanted you to wake up and face reality." I did not let her finish the excuse. "You looked at Mrs. Gable, your next-door neighbor who had stepped outside to see the commotion," I said, enunciating every single word with razor-sharp precision. "You pointed at me, laughed, and told her that your only daughter was Shanice. You told her I was just a stray relative who could not get her life together. You stripped me of my title as your child simply because my bank account was empty. You do not get to walk into a building paid for by my maritime logistics software and try to claim the title of mother now that my bank account is full." The room fell completely silent. The absolute truth of my words stripped away the last remnants of Beverly's fabricated maternal warmth. She shrank back, moving behind Elijah for protection, her face pale and trembling. She had tried to play the role of the proud matriarch, and I had publicly dismantled her using her own historic cruelty. Shanice, who had been standing quietly beside Chad, suddenly let out a loud and theatrical sob. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving as she thrust herself into the center of the conflict. The golden daughter was taking the stage, pivoting the family dynamic back to the only strategy they had left. "I cannot believe you are doing this!" Imani Shanice wailed, her voice thick with exaggerated agony. She leaned heavily against Chad, ensuring he had to wrap his arm around her shoulders to support her frail and collapsing frame. "How can you be so incredibly heartless? Mom and Dad are standing here trying to make peace, and you are throwing ancient history in their faces just to be cruel." I watched her perform. It was the same routine she had used since we were children. Whenever I established a boundary, Shanice would weaponize her tears to make me look like the aggressor. "You are sitting up here in your glass tower, holding on to all this anger while your own family is drowning," Shanice cried, pointing a trembling finger at me. Malik is losing sleep. Chad is working himself to the bone to provide for us. Mom and Dad are terrified about losing the house. And you are just standing there punishing us because of money. You are letting greed tear this entire family apart. You have all this wealth, and instead of helping us, you are using it to abuse the people who raised you. I looked at my sister. I looked at the perfectly manufactured tears streaming down her face, the way she clung to her white husband for protection, and the way she tried to shift the blame for their impending financial ruin onto my shoulders. She genuinely believed that her tears would break my resolve. She thought accusing me of greed would shame me into opening my checkbook just to prove her wrong. I did not feel shame. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt the satisfying and heavy weight of the financial dossier sitting in my portfolio, knowing that her tears were nothing compared to the absolute devastation I was about to unleash. Shanice buried her face in Chad's shoulder, her theatrical sobbing filling the expansive boardroom. Chad wrapped a protective arm around her, patting her back with exaggerated sympathy. He looked at me with a deep scowl, clearly deciding that it was his turn to play the hero. He stepped away from his weeping wife and marched directly up to my custom mahogany conference table. He unclasped a battered leather satchel and aggressively pulled out a thick, disorganized stack of manila folders. He slammed the entire messy pile down onto the pristine surface of my table. The papers spilled out dog-eared and stained with coffee rings, a perfect visual representation of his entire chaotic existence. "Sit down, Imani," Chad commanded, pointing a finger at one of the leather executive chairs. "Let us cut the emotional nonsense and talk like adults. You got incredibly lucky playing around with computers, and I will give you credit for securing the bag. But you are clearly out of your depth when it comes to managing actual capital." I remained standing. I did not even glance at the crumpled documents he had just thrown onto my table. I kept my eyes locked onto his, watching the unearned confidence radiate from his posture. Chad slapped his hand flat against the top folder. "This is a comprehensive portfolio of residential and commercial properties across the greater Atlanta area. I have secured the contracts, I have the contractors lined up, and I have the vision. What I am missing is liquid capital, because the current lending market is hostile to aggressive growth strategies. But you have capital. I need a revolving line of credit for $3 million. I also need you to act as a primary guarantor on 2 upcoming commercial acquisitions." He paused, puffing out his chest, attempting to sound like a seasoned investment banker instead of a man who flipped cheap houses using predatory loans. "It is time for you to start thinking about the bigger picture, Imani. You cannot just hoard your money on a boat. We hear all this talk about building Black generational wealth, right? Well, this is your opportunity to actually contribute to your family legacy. Your money needs to be reinvested into hard assets, and I am offering you the chance to partner with a proven developer to secure the Taylor family future. You just need to sign the guarantor forms today, and we can wire the initial $3 million by tomorrow morning." The absolute audacity of a mediocre white man standing in the penthouse of my corporate headquarters, demanding $3 million while lecturing me about Black generational wealth, was almost cinematic in its absurdity. He truly believed he was imparting profound financial wisdom. He thought he was doing me a favor by allowing me to finance his collapsing real estate scam. He assumed that because I was a Black woman, I needed a white man to legitimize my fortune by tying it to his fraudulent business ventures. I looked at the crumpled papers. I saw a foreclosure notice peeking out from under a poorly drafted architectural sketch. I did not touch the documents. I did not give Chad the satisfaction of engaging with his delusional pitch. Instead, I shifted my gaze past his shoulder, looking directly at the man who had brought him into my building. "Elijah," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level, "I want you to look at me right now and answer one very simple question. Is this the man you have chosen to speak for the Taylor family?" Elijah stiffened his broad shoulders, tensing under his suit. He stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down in front of Malik and Beverly. "Chad is a businessman, Imani. He understands how the real world operates. He has a plan to build up this family, which is a lot more than you have ever done." I took a slow, deliberate step toward my father. "You are standing in a building that I own, surrounded by an international empire that I built from the ground up, and you are telling me that this man understands the real world. Let me be absolutely clear about who this man is, since you apparently lack the basic financial literacy to run a background check on your own son-in-law. Chad has bankrupted 3 separate construction businesses in the last 7 years. He has a trail of unpaid contractors and code violations stretching from here to the state line. He is currently facing multiple lawsuits for fraud, and his credit score is lower than the freezing temperature outside. Chad went rigid, his face flushing a dark, angry red. You do not know what you are talking about. Those were strategic corporate restructurings. He snapped, his voice raising in panic. I ignored Chad completely, keeping my eyes locked on Elijah. I asked my father if he was seriously standing in my boardroom demanding that I hand over $3 million to a serial failure simply because Chad looked the part of a traditional patriarch. I asked him if his desperate need to proximity to whiteness and corporate legitimacy had blinded him to the fact that his son-in-law was bleeding him dry. Elijah slammed his fist onto the back of a leather chair. Do not, you dare speak to us with that arrogant tone, he roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Chad is the only one in this room trying to keep this family afloat while you are off living a secret life of luxury. Chad respects the family hierarchy. He knows how to lead. He came to me man to man and laid out a vision to protect our assets. You got lucky with some software program, Imani, but you lack discipline. You need a strong hand to guide your investments, and your brother-in-law is offering to manage your portfolio so you do not squander it all. You are going to sign those papers today, and you are going to thank him for treating you like an equal partner. The betrayal was absolute and unwavering. Elijah had just cemented his allegiance to a con artist over his own daughter. He was so deeply entrenched in his own toxic pride that he would rather watch his family burn to the ground under Chad's fraudulent leadership than admit that the daughter he threw away had become a titan. He defended the man who was actively destroying him simply because accepting my power would mean admitting his own monumental failure. Beverly chimed in, stepping up beside Elijah with her arms crossed tight against her chest. Your father is right, Imani. Chad has been a rock for us. When your brother Malik was struggling with his shipping routes last year, Chad stepped up and helped him secure the financing to keep his trucks on the road. We operate as a unit. We support each other. You do not get to walk back into our lives and start dictating terms just because you have a fancy office. You need to show some respect and do what is best for the family structure. I looked at the 4 of them standing united on the other side of my mahogany table. Chad was smirking again, emboldened by the unquestioning loyalty of my parents. Malik was nodding aggressively, sweating through his shirt, as he clung to the hope that my money would save his sinking logistics firm. Shanice had stopped crying, wiping her eyes and glaring at me with raw, undisguised entitlement. They truly believed they had me cornered by the sheer weight of familial obligation. They thought their unified front would break my resolve and shame me into submission. They were so arrogant. They were so incredibly confident in their manipulation that they had just freely admitted to a financial reality they should have kept completely hidden. Beverly had just proudly declared that Chad helped Malik secure financing. Elijah had just boldly stated that Chad laid out a vision to protect their assets. They thought they were proving a point about family loyalty, but they had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy them. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I picked up my sleek digital tablet from the center of the table and held it in my hands, feeling the smooth metal against my palms. I looked at Chad, then at Malik, and finally at Elijah and Beverly. So I said, letting a cold, razor-sharp smile spread across my face, what you are telling me is that all of your finances are deeply and legally intertwined. You are standing in my office admitting that you consolidated your assets to fund Chad's real estate flips and Malik's corporate logistics firm. Chad crossed his arms, leaning back with a look of absolute triumph. That is exactly what we are telling you. We leveraged our collective equity to maximize our market position. It is basic economics, Imani. Now stop stalling and sign the guarantor forms so we can finalize the bridge loan and keep our projects moving forward. I kept my eyes locked on his, my smile never wavering. I tapped the screen of my tablet once, preparing to show them exactly what their collective equity actually looked like. I kept my finger hovering just millimeters above the screen of my tablet. The glass was cool beneath my touch, a stark contrast to the heated, desperate energy vibrating across my custom mahogany table. I looked at the five of them standing shoulder to shoulder in a twisted display of unity. They were so incredibly proud of their financial maneuvering. They wanted my money, but they also demanded my submission. They expected me to bow to their collective business acumen. I lowered the tablet and placed it face down on the table. I folded my hands together. "If you want $3 million," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, climate-controlled silence of the penthouse boardroom, "I need to hear exactly how you structured this. You claim you leveraged the family equity to maximize your market position. I want to know the exact terms. I want to hear the brilliant strategy that brought you to my office on a Monday morning to demand my capital." Chad took the bait instantly. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on my table, entirely oblivious to the trap I had just set. "It is a standard cross-collateralization strategy," Chad explained, his chest puffing out with unearned confidence. He spoke with the cadence of a man who watched real estate seminars online, but had absolutely no idea how institutional finance actually worked. "We took out a series of short-term, high-yield, hard money loans. I used your father's commercial warehouse district as the primary collateral, and we leveraged the remaining equity in your parents' home as a secondary guarantee. It freed up massive amounts of liquid cash for my development projects." Malik wiped his forehead with his sleeve and nodded eagerly, desperate to prove he was part of this masterclass in business. "Chad secured the capital so I could cover the massive overhead for my logistics fleet," Malik chimed in, his voice cracking slightly. "We bundled the debt. It was a strategic risk, Amani. You have to spend money to make money. We basically created an internal family hedge fund. If you had stayed in contact with us, you would have seen how we leveled up." I stared at my older brother. The sheer financial illiteracy was staggering. "You took out predatory hard money loans against a paid-off family home and revenue-generating commercial real estate to fund depreciating logistics assets and speculative residential flips," I stated, stripping away their buzzwords to expose the absolute stupidity of their actions. Elijah bristled at my clinical tone. He stepped closer to the table, his face flushed with indignation. "It is called building an empire, Imani. Something you clearly do not understand since you hide behind computer screens and rely on other people's boats to look successful. We took a calculated risk to accelerate our growth. Chad had the connections to private lenders that we needed." "And how is that growth accelerating today?" I asked, leaning back in my leather executive chair. "Because hard money lenders do not offer 30-year fixed rates. They offer 12-month terms with balloon payments and extortionate interest. So tell me, Chad, when is the balloon payment due?" Chad's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He glanced at Elijah. Beverly shifted her weight nervously, her knockoff designer purse clutched tightly against her ribs. Shanice looked away, suddenly very interested in the Atlanta skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. "That is exactly why you need to sign those guarantor papers today," Beverly snapped, her voice shrill with rising panic. She stepped in front of Chad, trying to shield him from my interrogation. The market shifted, Imani. The contractors delayed Chad's projects, and Malik's clients were late on their invoices. It is just a temporary setback. But the lenders are being completely unreasonable. They are refusing to extend the terms. They are demanding the principal balance. "You are in default," I stated. It was not a question. Shanice stepped forward, her dramatic tears completely gone, replaced by a hardened, entitled glare. "We have 3 weeks, Imani. 3 weeks before they initiate foreclosure proceedings on Mom and Dad's house. Chad's development properties are already locked up with liens. We need the $3 million wired to Chad's holding account to satisfy the primary lender, and we need your signature to refinance the remaining commercial debt." They confessed to everything. In their blind arrogance, they laid out their utter incompetence, their reckless gambling with the family's foundational wealth, and their complete failure to manage a single viable business. They had literally handed the deeds to their entire lives over to private institutional lenders, to fund the delusions of a mediocre white man who could not successfully flip a single house. Yet they stood there looking at me as if I were the one who owed them an apology. Elijah crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set in a hard line of patriarchal authority. Chad smirked, running a hand through his hair, thoroughly convinced he had successfully pitched a masterclass in real estate development to an amateur. Beverly let out a long, dramatic sigh, looking up at the ceiling, as if explaining this to me had been an exhausting, ungrateful burden. They truly believed they had me trapped in a corner. In their minds, family obligation was an ironclad contract that I could not break, no matter how terribly they had treated me. They expected me to panic at the word foreclosure. They expected the broke, desperate 30-year-old girl they threw into the freezing rain to resurface terrified of losing her parents' approval. They fully expected me to reach into my tailored linen blazer, pull out a platinum corporate checkbook, and wipe away their multi-million-dollar mistakes just to buy my way back into their good graces. I looked at each of them. I let the silence stretch out heavy, pressurized, and suffocating. I wanted to memorize the exact look of smug entitlement on their faces. I wanted to remember the way Chad stood in my boardroom, a man demanding the fruits of a black woman's relentless labor to cover his own spectacular failures. I wanted to remember the way Elijah and Beverly stood behind him like loyal foot soldiers, entirely willing to sacrifice my corporate empire to save the son-in-law who was actively destroying their lives. "We do not have all day," Imani Chad said, tapping his watch impatiently. "I have contractors waiting on my approval. Sign the papers so we can get this wire transfer initiated." I did not reach for a checkbook. I did not offer a single word of maternal comfort to Beverly or daughterly submission to Elijah. I did not argue with Chad about his atrocious business model. I simply reached across the smooth mahogany wood and picked up my digital tablet. "You really believe you took a calculated risk," I said, my voice dropping into a register so dark and absolute that Malik physically took a step backward. "You really believe you are negotiating a bridge loan with a sister who just got lucky on a boat in Miami?" I held the tablet in my hand, feeling the solid weight of the technology that controlled my entire global operation. I looked dead into Chad's eyes, watching the first tiny flicker of uncertainty finally register in his expression. I tapped the mirrorcast icon on my screen. The massive 70-inch presentation monitor mounted on the far wall of the boardroom flared to life, illuminating the room with a crisp, brilliant light. They expected me to pull out a checkbook to save them. Instead, I pulled up the very instrument of their destruction. Before the screen could even cast its bright light across the room, Beverly threw her hands into the air and let out a sharp, ragged gasp. She lunged forward, pressing her body against the edge of my mahogany table, her eyes wide with a terrifying blend of theatrical grief and absolute desperation. "Imani, please." She wept, her voice trembling with a carefully practiced vulnerability that she had weaponized against me my entire life. "Look at me. Look at your mother. How can you sit there in your fancy clothes and treat us like strangers? I changed your diapers. I stayed up with you when you had the chicken pox. I cooked your meals, I bought your school clothes, and I poured my youth into raising you. I sacrificed my body, my career, and my dreams so you could grow up healthy. And now you sit on a mountain of money and act like you owe us nothing. Is this how a black daughter treats the woman who bled for her?" She pulled a crumpled tissue from her sleeve, dabbing at the corners of her eyes, waiting for the familiar guilt to take root. She was laying the classic family duty trap, trying to reduce my corporate empire to a debt of gratitude for basic parental survival requirements. She genuinely believed that feeding a child she chose to bring into the world gave her a permanent lien-free mortgage on my adult earnings. I set the tablet flat on the table, resting my hands over the cool glass. I did not blink. I did not soften my expression. I looked at her with the cold diagnostic detachment of a forensic accountant reviewing an embezzler's ledger. "Let us talk about your sacrifices, Beverly," I said, my voice cutting through her manufactured sobs like a scalpel. "You love to talk about meals and school clothes, so let us review the exact timeline of your motherhood. On October 14th, 2008, when I won a full academic scholarship to study computer science, you did not throw a party. You did not even buy a cake. You took the $500 my high school counselor awarded me for books and used it to buy Malik a custom leather jacket for his freshman year at State College because you said a young black man needed to look successful. Beverly's theatrical tears froze instantly. Her jaw slackened as I began to unpack the historical record she thought I had forgotten. Let us jump to June 3rd, 2015. I continued my voice perfectly, even carrying across the silent, pressurized space of the boardroom. I was hospitalized with severe pneumonia while working 30 hours a week to fund my first software prototype. I called you from the emergency room, asking if you could drive 20 minutes to bring me clean clothes and a warm blanket. You told me you were too busy because Malik had a golf tournament with his corporate buddies, and his networking took priority over my drama. Elijah shifted uncomfortably beside her, his face darkening, but I did not pause. I hit them with every single date, every single act of emotional abandonment, stripping away 30 years of maternal mythology in less than 2 minutes. And let us never forget November 12th. 5 years ago, I said, leaning forward until my face was inches from hers. I came to your house with flu symptoms, $90 left in my bank account, and a broken spirit after my first company collapsed. I asked for 2 weeks on your guest bed so I could finalize the maritime logistics algorithm that currently powers global trade. You did not cook me a warm meal, Beverly. You did not offer me a blanket. You packed my single suitcase, dragged it to the front porch, and threw it directly into a muddy puddle in the pouring rain. Beverly opened her mouth, her hands fluttering in panic. You looked me dead in the eye. I interrupted, announcing every single syllable with razor-sharp precision, and you said, and I quote, "You are a useless leech, Imani. Shanice is a real daughter who respects this family. You are dead to us. Do not ever bring your failures back to my doorstep." The absolute truth of those exact words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Beverly sank back into her chair, her face drained of all color, her fabricated maternal pride utterly dismantled. She had tried to trap me with guilt, and I had buried her under the exact receipts of her own cruelty. Elijah's face turned a violent dark purple. The patriarchal authority he had held over our family for decades completely cracked. He could not handle seeing his wife exposed, and he could not tolerate his black sheep daughter holding all the power. He slammed his massive fist down onto the mahogany table with a thunderous crack that echoed off the glass walls. "Enough!" Elijah roared, his voice booming with pure, unfiltered rage as he stood up, towering over the table. "Stop disrespecting your mother in front of these people. I do not care about 10 years ago. I do not care about your damn feelings. You are going to stop this arrogant, ungrateful attitude right now. Open that checkbook and write the damn check." I did not flinch when Elijah slammed his fist against the mahogany table. The loud, sharp crack echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a desperate and violent attempt to reclaim the patriarchal authority I had just stripped away from him. He stood there panting, his chest heaving under his suit, waiting for me to shrink back into the subservient daughter he remembered. He expected me to drop my gaze. He expected the sheer volume of his voice to override the undeniable facts I had just laid bare regarding Beverly's historical cruelty. I kept my hands resting lightly on my digital tablet. I turned my head slowly, moving my gaze away from my father's furious face with the kind of calculated, unhurried precision that signaled total indifference. Dismissing an angry man's physical intimidation is far more devastating than yelling back at him. I simply erased his outburst from the agenda. My eyes landed squarely on Malik. The golden child swallowed hard. He saw his father's absolute failure to control the room, and he realized he was the next target in the firing line. But Malik had spent his entire life being told he was brilliant, capable, and destined for greatness simply by virtue of being the firstborn son. He took a deep breath, straightening his posture and adjusting the lapels of his off-the-rack suit. He was trying to summon the aura of a seasoned corporate executive handling a tense boardroom negotiation. He stepped slightly in front of our parents, attempting to act as the voice of reason. "Let us bring the temperature down in here," Malik said, adopting a low, placating tone that sounded entirely rehearsed. "Mom and Dad are just highly emotional right now because the stakes are incredibly high." But you and I are business people, Imani. We understand how corporate finance works. We do not need to drag family baggage into a straightforward capital discussion. I tilted my head, studying him. You want to have a straightforward capital discussion? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Exactly. Malik nodded, looking momentarily relieved that I was willing to pivot away from our toxic family history. He placed one hand in his pocket, trying to project casual confidence. Let us look at the facts. My logistics firm is a cornerstone of the regional supply chain. We employ dozens of people in the community. I have a proven track record of moving freight across the Southeast. We hit a temporary snag because of unexpected supply chain disruptions and inflated diesel costs. That is all this is. A temporary snag. I am not asking for a handout, Imani. I am offering you an equity position in exchange for a short-term bridge loan. $50,000 gets my trucks back on the road by tomorrow morning, and you get a guaranteed return on investment within 6 months. He offered me a tight professional smile. It was the exact same patronizing smile he wore 5 years ago on the front porch. You know software? He continued, his tone dripping with the subtle condescension of a man who believed physical assets were the only real metric of wealth. But I know tangible assets. I know freight. I know how the real world operates. This is a mutually beneficial arrangement. You provide the liquid capital, and I provide the operational infrastructure. I let the silence stretch out for 10 seconds. I watched a drop of sweat roll down the side of his temple. You do not need a bridge loan, Malik, I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the polished wood. A bridge loan is a financial instrument designed to cover short-term obligations while securing long-term permanent financing. You are not bridging a gap. You are standing on the edge of a cliff, asking me to build you a parachute out of cash because your entire corporate structure is currently in free fall. Malik's smile vanished instantly. His hand slipped out of his pocket. Imani, you do not know the market variables I am dealing with. I know that your gross revenue was down 42% in Q3, I interrupted, not even looking down at the messy folders Chad had thrown on the table. I kept my eyes locked onto his, reciting his internal corporate data entirely from memory. I know that you are currently 90 days delinquent on the lease for your primary distribution warehouse. I know that your fleet consists of outdated gas-guzzling trucks that spend more time in the repair shop than they do on the highway. I know that you lost your 2 largest commercial shipping contracts last month because your delivery failure rate hit an astronomical 19%. The blood drained completely from Malik's face. He looked as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. Elijah and Beverly stared at their golden son in absolute shock. They had clearly been fed a heavily sanitized version of his business troubles. How do you know those numbers? Malik whispered, his voice cracking with genuine terror. His corporate facade was disintegrating by the second. Those are internal ledger metrics. Because I do my due diligence before I let anyone walk into my building and demand my money, I said, leaning forward. But let us talk about that operational infrastructure you are so proud of. You claim you hit a temporary snag due to fuel costs. But fuel costs do not explain why you took a $250,000 owner's draw last quarter while your freight coordinators were threatening to strike over bounced paychecks. Shanice gasped loudly. Beverly covered her mouth with her hand, looking at Malik with wide, horrified eyes. The golden boy had been bleeding his own company dry to maintain his personal lifestyle. You bought a brand new luxury SUV 2 months ago. Malik, I continued, surgically dismantling his entire reputation in front of the parents who worshipped him. You maintained your expensive country club membership. You paid for premium box seats at the stadium. You siphoned the operating capital out of your own logistics firm so you could keep posting pictures online, playing golf with other executives, desperately trying to look like a titan of industry while your employees could not pay their rent. That is not true, Malik stammered, backing away from the table. The owner's draw was a previously scheduled compensation package. I had to maintain a certain image to attract high-level investors. You had to maintain an image because reality was too difficult for you to manage, I countered effortlessly. You want to talk about how the real world operates? Let us talk about the maritime logistics software you laughed at 5 years ago. Do you remember standing on the porch holding your coffee mug telling me I was delusional? Telling me I was playing on a computer while the real men ran the world? Malik swallowed hard, unable to meet my eyes. He looked down at the mahogany table, thoroughly humiliated. That computer software now routes 30% of the commercial freight entering the eastern seaboard, I informed him, driving the final nail into his corporate coffin. I digitized supply chains. I implemented predictive analytics that reduce fuel consumption by millions of dollars annually. Meanwhile, you refused to upgrade your routing software because you were too arrogant to admit you did not understand the technology. You ran a 21st century logistics firm using 1990s methodology, and the market did not just shift, Malik. It evolved, and it left you behind to die. He was completely exposed. The brilliant, infallible son had been revealed as a financially illiterate fraud who prioritized his ego over his employees. He looked physically ill, his breathing shallow and rapid, as the crushing weight of his incompetence was laid bare in front of his father. Elijah stared at Malik, his chest no longer puffed out with patriarchal rage, but sagging under the realization that the son he had staked the family legacy on was a total failure. "You have nothing to offer me," I said, delivering the final verdict with absolute chilling finality. "You do not have operational infrastructure. You have a liability. You walked into my boardroom demanding $50,000 to cover a payroll shortage that you created by stealing from your own company. You are not a cornerstone of the community. You are a grifter in a cheap suit, and I do not finance grifters." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The Taylor family hierarchy had been completely inverted. The golden child was shattered, standing quietly with his head bowed, thoroughly stripped of his pride. I had taken his corporate identity, held it up to the light, and crushed it into dust without ever raising my voice. But Chad could not handle the silence. The white brother-in-law syndrome flared up with a violent, desperate intensity. He could not tolerate the fact that Malik had been systematically destroyed, not because he cared about Malik, but because Malik's financial ruin directly impacted his own access to capital. More importantly, Chad could not stand the fact that my attention had been diverted away from him and his supposedly brilliant real estate schemes. He needed to be the center of authority. He needed to prove that he was the only one in the room who actually knew how to handle business. Chad slammed his hand down flat against the stack of messy folders he had placed on the table earlier. The loud smack made Shanice jump, but I simply shifted my eyes toward him, entirely unimpressed by his display of temper. "This is a complete waste of time," Chad shouted, his face twisting into an ugly, entitled scowl. "I do not care about Malik's trucks, and I do not care about your petty family drama from 5 years ago. You are deliberately stalling Amani. I brought you a portfolio of tangible, high-yield real estate investments, and you are sitting here playing games to make yourself feel powerful. Look at these properties." He shoved the disorganized stack of papers across the polished wood, pushing them aggressively into my personal space. The folders slid across the table, several loose foreclosure notices and poorly drafted architectural sketches spilling out onto the mahogany surface. "I am not leaving this building until we finalize the line of credit for my LLC," Chad demanded, pointing a rigid finger at my face. "You are going to stop tearing down your brother. You are going to focus on the actual assets I brought to the table, and you are going to sign the guarantor forms right now." Elijah stared at the massive screen, his eyes tracing the bold black letters of my name at the very top of the corporate hierarchy. His lips parted, but no sound escaped. The booming patriarch who had thrown my suitcase into the rain, the man who had just minutes ago demanded my submission, was entirely paralyzed. Beverly's hands flew to her mouth. She took a stumbling step backward, colliding with the edge of the mahogany table. The knockoff designer purse she had been clutching slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull, pathetic thud. She looked from the screen to me, her face contorted in an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. Chad's arrogant posture collapsed entirely. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The white brother-in-law who had demanded I bat my eyelashes at a sugar daddy, the man who had tried to lecture me about black generational wealth, realized in a single crushing instant that he had handed the deeds to his entire fraudulent real estate portfolio directly to me. "You?" Malik whispered, his voice trembling so violently it cracked. His eyes were wide, darting erratically across the organizational chart on the monitor. You are Apex Holdings. You are the private equity firm. I did not offer a polite confirmation. I did not smile. I placed my tablet gently on the table and let the silence stretch until the sheer gravity of my power suffocated the last remaining ounce of their defiance. I am the institution, Chad, I said, my voice cold, precise and echoing with absolute finality. I am the private lender you ran to when traditional banks laughed you out of their lobbies. When your original creditors wanted to write off your toxic high-interest debt 3 months ago to clear their books, my asset managers flagged the portfolios. I saw the addresses of the commercial warehouse district. I saw the address of the suburban family home. I saw the corporate filings for a failing logistics company. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the 5 of them. I did not hack your accounts, Elijah. I continued, holding my father's terrified gaze. I bought them. I purchased your distressed debt, your primary mortgages, and your corporate liabilities from the institutional lenders for pennies on the dollar through my shell corporation. I did not need to spy on your missed payments because those payments were supposed to be deposited into my bank accounts. Shanice let out a low, whimpering sound, clutching Chad's arm. But Chad was completely unresponsive, staring at the floor as the mathematical reality of his ruin calculated in his mind. You have spent the last 5 years pretending I did not exist, I said, sweeping my gaze across the group. You threw me into the street and told me I was dead to you. You laughed at my ambition. And then, when your own greed and incompetence brought you to the brink of total annihilation, you walked into my corporate headquarters and demanded my money to save yourselves. I walked back to the head of the table, picking up the leather portfolio I had brought down from my desk. I pulled out a stack of crisp, legally binding documents stamped with the official seal of my legal counsel. You came here today looking for a bridge loan, I stated, sliding the documents across the polished mahogany wood until they rested directly in front of Elijah and Chad. You expected me to write a check to satisfy Apex Holdings, but you forgot the cardinal rule of high-yield distress debt. When you breach the 90-day cure period, the lender is no longer required to negotiate. I tapped my finger sharply against the top document. This is the formal notice of debt acceleration and immediate foreclosure, I announced. I am not granting an extension. I am not refinancing your liabilities. Because you are in absolute breach of contract, I am calling the entire principal balance due immediately. Beverly let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped to her knees right there in the boardroom, her hands clasping the edge of my table. Imani, no. Please, I am your mother. You cannot take our home. You cannot put us on the street. We are your blood. Please have mercy on us. I looked down at the woman weeping on my floor. I felt absolutely nothing. You told me I was not your blood 5 years ago, Beverly. I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. You told me your only daughter was Shanice. I suggest you ask Shanice and Chad if you can sleep on their couch, but unfortunately their residential properties are included in this foreclosure package. Elijah fell into the nearest leather chair, his hands covering his face. The mighty patriarch was completely broken, weeping silently as his entire legacy was legally transferred to the daughter he had discarded. Malik stood frozen, realizing his trucks, his warehouse, and his entire identity were gone. Chad suddenly snapped. The sheer humiliation of being utterly defeated by a black woman broke his fragile ego. He let out a furious, animalistic yell and lunged across the table, his hands reaching violently for my throat. You set us up, you arrogant! He did not even make it halfway. Before Chad's hands could cross the center of the table, Jackson and the second armed security guard closed the distance with terrifying speed. Jackson grabbed Chad by the back of his collar and the belt of his trousers, lifting him entirely off his feet and slamming him face first into the thick glass wall of the boardroom. The impact echoed with a sickening thud. Chad groaned, instantly subdued, as Jackson pinned his arms behind his back. Do not move a single muscle, Jackson commanded, his voice deadly calm. I did not flinch. I calmly adjusted the cuff of my linen blazer. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate my building, I told the remaining 4 family members, who were staring at Chad in absolute horror. If you are not in the lobby elevators by the time the timer runs out, Jackson will have all of you arrested for criminal trespassing. Eviction proceedings for the suburban home, the commercial district, and the logistics warehouses will commence on Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. I suggest you start packing." I did not wait for their response. I did not stay to watch them cry over the paperwork of their own destruction. I turned my back on them, walking smoothly toward my private executive elevator. The doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside the glass carriage, pressing the button for the underground private garage. As the doors began to close, cutting off the sounds of Beverly's hysterical sobbing and Chad's muffled groans against the glass wall, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from the family group chat. Aunt Cheryl was typing frantically, sending paragraph after paragraph of desperate backpedaling, apologizing for the live stream and begging me not to punish the rest of the family. I smiled. I tapped the screen, blocked her number, and permanently deleted the entire Taylor family group chat. The elevator doors sealed shut, descending smoothly toward the garage where my chauffeured car was already waiting. My driver opened the door as I approached. "To the airport, Ms. Taylor?" he asked respectfully. "Yes," I replied, sliding into the plush leather back seat. "Take me to the airport. The Sovereign is waiting in Miami, and the sea has never looked clearer." The car glided out of the parking garage into the bright Atlanta sunshine. The debt was paid. The past was foreclosed, and I was entirely beautifully free. The massive 70-inch presentation monitor mounted on the far wall of the boardroom flared to life. The stark white background illuminated the faces of my family with a cold and clinical light. The organizational chart of Apex Holdings unfolded across the screen in real time. At the bottom of the graphic were the subsidiary limited liability companies, the holding accounts, and the distressed debt acquisition portfolios. Solid black lines tracked upward past the managing directors and the shell company structures. The chart converged into a single point of ultimate authority at the very top. The name occupying the highest position was not a faceless corporate board or a consortium of anonymous investors. It was my name. Imani Taylor, founder, sole managing member, and chief executive officer. I watched their eyes track the lines on the screen. The absolute silence in the boardroom was suffocating. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of 5 deeply arrogant people watching their entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. Elijah squinted at the monitor, his thick eyebrows pulled together as if the crisp black text was written in a foreign language. He was trying to comprehend how the daughter he had discarded could possibly be sitting at the top of a financial hierarchy that controlled his life. Beverly leaned forward with her mouth slightly open. She was completely unable to process the legal documentation displayed in front of her. Shanice looked frantically from the screen to Chad, waiting for her husband to explain the financial terminology and assure her that this was some kind of elaborate prank. Chad was the first to understand. He was a fraud and a terrible businessman, but he knew enough about real estate holding structures to recognize a corporate death warrant when he saw one. The smug, entitled sneer wiped completely off his face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. He took a stumbling step backward, his hip bumping hard into the edge of my mahogany table. The arrogant posture he had maintained since walking into my building evaporated. He suddenly looked like a terrified child who had just accidentally stepped on a landmine. "You wanted to talk about tangible assets," I said. My voice carried the steady, chilling cadence of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You wanted to lecture me about building a family legacy and understanding the real world. Let me welcome you to my world." I slowly stood up from my leather executive chair. I kept my eyes locked on the group, refusing to let them look away from the absolute authority I now commanded in the room. 5 years ago, after you threw me into the rain, I did not just build a simple tracking application. I explained, walking deliberately around the edge of the conference table. My software completely revolutionized global maritime logistics. It optimized shipping routes for international conglomerates and generated the kind of capital that makes your predatory hard money lenders look like children trading lunch money. But I did not stop at software. Wealth is about aggressive diversification. I took my capital and built Apex Holdings. I created a private equity firm specializing in the acquisition of distressed high-risk debt. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the monitor, letting my name shine brightly above my head. 3 months ago, your primary lenders realized that your cross-collateralized hedge fund was a toxic, collapsing disaster, I continued. Chad's residential flips were bleeding cash. Malik's logistics firm was in free fall. The commercial real estate you used as a secondary guarantee was rapidly depreciating in value. The banks wanted to clear their ledgers of your terrible decisions before the end of the fiscal quarter. They put your entire debt portfolio up for sale on the secondary market. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. I watched the realization wash over them, a slow-moving tidal wave of pure dread. I bought it, I stated with absolute unyielding finality. I bought every single cent of your liabilities. I bought the third mortgage on the suburban family home. I bought the deeds to the commercial warehouse district. I bought the paper on Malik's outdated trucking fleet. I bought the high-interest hard money loans funding Chad's fraudulent development projects. I purchased your entire existence for pennies on the dollar through my shell corporation. Beverly gasped loudly. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching her pearl necklace as if it could protect her from the truth. She looked at Elijah, panic finally breaking through her meticulously maintained country club facade. "What does she mean?" Elijah Beverly demanded, her voice trembling with hysteria. "Tell me what she means right now." Elijah could not answer her. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle spasmed violently in his cheek. He was staring at the screen, the crushing weight of his monumental failure paralyzing his tongue. The patriarch who had demanded my submission, who had ordered me to respect his authority, was completely broken. He had handed the keys to his kingdom over to a white son-in-law who had promptly driven them all off a financial cliff. And now, the only person standing at the bottom to catch them was the daughter he had declared dead. Malik let out a low, ragged breath. He physically slumped into his chair, dropping his head into his trembling hands. The tailored suit he wore to intimidate me suddenly looked like a cheap, oversized costume. The golden child identity he had worn his entire life dissolved into nothing. "You are Apex Holdings," Malik whispered to the floor, his voice completely hollow and defeated. "You are the private institution we have been paying all this time. You are the lender who refused to extend our terms. I did not just survive after you discarded me," I told him, looking down at the top of his head. "I became the very institution you are currently begging for mercy. When you were ignoring my existence, I was reviewing your profit and loss statements. When you were bragging online about your brand new luxury vehicles, I was authorizing your default notices. I did not need to spy on your bank accounts, Malik, because those accounts legally belong to me." I turned my attention away from my brother and stepped right in front of Chad. He refused to look me in the eye. He was staring down at the mahogany wood, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The confidence he had weaponized against me in the lobby was entirely gone. "You walked into my building and demanded a $3 million bridge loan," I said, letting the cold mockery drip from every single syllable. "You stood in my boardroom and told me that I needed your strong hand to guide my investments. You assumed that because I am a black woman, I must have stumbled into this wealth by accident, or relied on a wealthy man to fund my life. You thought you could bully a lucky girl into financing your rescue operation so you could play the savior for my parents." Chad clenched his fists at his sides, but he did not speak. The fragile foundation of his superiority had been pulverized. "But you did not walk into a family meeting today, Chad," I promised him, leaning in slightly so he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "You walked directly into the jaws of your primary creditor. You are not pitching a business partnership. You are standing in front of the woman who legally owns your homes, your businesses, and your entire financial future. You do not have a family equity safety net anymore. You just have me." The absolute silence in the boardroom was no longer just heavy. It was a suffocating physical weight pressing down on the chest of every single person who had walked into my building expecting a handout. I watched the realization of total financial annihilation rewrite the structural biology of my father. Elijah seemed to age a decade in the span of 10 seconds. The broad shoulders that had carried his aggressive patriarchal authority for my entire life suddenly slumped inward. He looked down at the official notices of debt acceleration resting on the mahogany table, and the booming baritone voice he had used to terrorize me since childhood completely evaporated. "Imani," he whispered. The sound was so small, so incredibly fragile and shaking, that it was almost unrecognizable as human speech coming from a man of his size. "Imani, please. You cannot do this. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot take the family home. You cannot put your own mother and father out on the street." I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting his pathetic shaking whisper echo off the glass walls. "You are a man obsessed with legacy." "Elijah," I said, my voice completely devoid of any rising emotion, "you love to talk about flesh and blood when you need something from me. But you did not care about flesh and blood when you handed the deeds of our ancestral properties over to predatory lenders to fund the delusions of your white son-in-law. You pawned off the Taylor family history to keep up appearances at your country club. And you certainly did not care about flesh and blood 5 years ago." He opened his mouth, his eyes wide and pleading, but I did not give him the space to formulate an excuse. "Do not stand in my corporate headquarters and beg me for mercy, using biology as a shield," I commanded, stepping closer to his trembling frame. "Because on a freezing Tuesday night 5 years ago, you looked me dead in my eyes and told me I was no longer your blood. You told me I was a stray dog taking up space in your perfect house. You legally and emotionally severed our bloodline the second you threw my suitcase into a muddy puddle and locked the front door. You made a choice to be a stranger to me. I am simply honoring your choice. I am not your daughter today. I am your primary creditor and you are in default." A sudden sharp wail shattered the tension. Beverly threw her hands into the air and physically collapsed. Her knees hit the plush carpet of the boardroom floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud. The carefully manicured matriarch, who had spent the last hour trying to shame me completely, abandoned her pride. She crawled forward on her knees, reaching her hands out frantically to grab the hem of my tailored linen trousers. My baby Beverly sobbed, tears streaming through her expensive makeup, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. She was weeping theatrically, gasping for air, as if she were the victim of some unimaginable tragedy. "Please, my baby girl, I am your mother. I carried you in my womb. I gave you life. You cannot destroy us like this. We will change. We will do whatever you want. Just rip up those papers. Please, Imani, remember that I am the mother who raised you." I did not flinch. I did not bend down to comfort her. As her grasping fingers came within an inch of my trousers, I took a smooth, calculated step to the left. I sidestepped her completely, leaving her reaching into empty air. She fell forward slightly, her hands slapping against the polished floor, weeping loudly into the carpet. "You do not get to use your womb as a toll booth, Beverly," I said, looking down at her shaking shoulders. "You do not get to demand a return on investment for basic biology. You love to play the devoted mother when there is an audience, but where was this maternal desperation when I was eating dry cereal and sleeping in a climate-controlled storage unit? Where was this weeping when I called you begging for a grocery gift card? You told me my poverty was a punishment from God. So consider this foreclosure a divine intervention." Shanice was backed against the glass wall, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. She was staring at Beverly groveling on the floor, and the reality of her own situation was finally registering. Shanice had spent her entire life riding the coattails of the golden child hierarchy. She had married Chad, assuming his proximity to white corporate America would guarantee her a life of effortless luxury. Now, she was staring at a sister who held the legal rights to evict her from her own subdivision. Shanice opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer her own pathetic apology, but she was entirely paralyzed by fear. Malik had not moved. He was still slumped in his executive chair, his head buried in his hands. He was hyperventilating, taking short, ragged breaths that rattled in his chest. His traditional logistics firm was gone. His trucks, his warehouse, his bloated salary, all legally seized by the sister he had mocked. He was utterly broken, entirely incapable of offering even a single word of defense. But Chad was a different story entirely. The absolute destruction of the Taylor family hierarchy was playing out right in front of him, but Chad could not process the outcome. The white brother-in-law syndrome was blinding him to the mathematical reality of his ruin. He had spent his entire life operating under the assumption that he was the smartest person in any room, particularly a room filled with black people. He had walked into my building expecting to extract $3 million from a woman he viewed as an uneducated lottery winner. Instead, I had just revealed that I was the phantom institutional lender who had been quietly buying up his toxic debt for the last 3 months. I was the one who had read his fraudulent contractor invoices. I was the one who had authorized his default notices. I had played him flawlessly. I had let him walk into my boardroom, slam his messy folders onto my table, and brag about his real estate portfolio, knowing the entire time that I already owned every single brick of his crumbling empire. The color rushed back into Chad's face, transforming his sickly pallor into a violent, burning crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his shirt collar. He looked at the foreclosure documents sitting on the table, and then his eyes snapped to me. The realization that he had been completely outplayed by a black woman shattered his fragile, entitled ego into a million jagged pieces. He could not accept the humiliation. He could not tolerate the fact that his aggressive posturing had been neutralized with effortless corporate precision. "You set us up!" Chad hissed, his voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated venom. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were stark white. "You malicious, vindictive fraud! You planned this. You deliberately bought our debt just to humiliate me. You deliberately let me structure those loans so you could trap my assets." I kept my expression perfectly neutral. "I did not need to trap you, Chad. You walked into the snare all by yourself because your arrogance convinced you that you were untouchable. You structured terrible loans because you are a terrible businessman. I just happened to be the one holding the net when you finally fell." The sheer icy calm of my response was the final breaking point. Chad lost his temper entirely. All pretense of corporate negotiation vanished, replaced by the raw, aggressive violence of a man who realized he had absolutely no power left. He let out a furious, guttural scream that echoed wildly off the boardroom walls. He lunged forward. He threw his entire body weight across the custom mahogany table, his arms extending violently as he reached directly for my throat. Papers went flying into the air, scattering across the room like confetti. He kicked over a leather chair in his blind rage, screaming that I was an arrogant witch who needed to be taught a permanent lesson. He genuinely believed that physical violence could reverse a legal foreclosure. He thought he could put his hands on me in my own building. The massive 70-inch presentation monitor mounted on the far wall of the boardroom flared to life. The stark white background illuminated the faces of my family with a cold and clinical light. The organizational chart of Apex Holdings unfolded across the screen in real time. At the bottom of the graphic were the subsidiary limited liability companies, the holding accounts, and the distressed debt acquisition portfolios. Solid black lines tracked upward past the managing directors and the shell company structures. The chart converged into a single point of ultimate authority at the very top. The name occupying the highest position was not a faceless corporate board or a consortium of anonymous investors. It was my name, Imani Taylor, founder, sole managing member, and chief executive officer. I watched their eyes track the lines on the screen. The absolute silence in the boardroom was suffocating. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of 5 deeply arrogant people watching their entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. Elijah squinted at the monitor, his thick eyebrows pulled together as if the crisp, black text was written in a foreign language. He was trying to comprehend how the daughter he had discarded could possibly be sitting at the top of a financial hierarchy that controlled his life. Beverly leaned forward with her mouth slightly open. She was completely unable to process the legal documentation displayed in front of her. Shanice looked frantically from the screen to Chad, waiting for her husband to explain the financial terminology and assure her that this was some kind of elaborate prank. Chad was the first to understand. He was a fraud and a terrible businessman, but he knew enough about real estate holding structures to recognize a corporate death warrant when he saw one. The smug, entitled sneer wiped completely off his face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. He took a stumbling step backward, his hip bumping hard into the edge of my mahogany table. The arrogant posture he had maintained since walking into my building evaporated. He suddenly looked like a terrified child who had just accidentally stepped on a landmine. "You wanted to talk about tangible assets," I said. My voice carried the steady, chilling cadence of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You wanted to lecture me about building a family legacy and understanding the real world. Let me welcome you to my world." I slowly stood up from my leather executive chair. I kept my eyes locked on the group, refusing to let them look away from the absolute authority I now commanded in the room. 5 years ago, after you threw me into the rain, I did not just build a simple tracking application. I explained, walking deliberately around the edge of the conference table. My software completely revolutionized global maritime logistics. It optimized shipping routes for international conglomerates and generated the kind of capital that makes your predatory hard money lenders look like children trading lunch money. But I did not stop at software. Wealth is about aggressive diversification. I took my capital and built Apex Holdings. I created a private equity firm specializing in the acquisition of distressed high-risk debt. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the monitor, letting my name shine brightly above my head. 3 months ago, your primary lenders realized that your cross-collateralized hedge fund was a toxic, collapsing disaster, I continued. Chad's residential flips were bleeding cash. Malik's logistics firm was in free fall. The commercial real estate you used as a secondary guarantee was rapidly depreciating in value. The banks wanted to clear their ledgers of your terrible decisions before the end of the fiscal quarter. They put your entire debt portfolio up for sale on the secondary market. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. I watched the realization wash over them, a slow-moving tidal wave of pure dread. "I bought it," I stated with absolute unyielding finality. "I bought every single cent of your liabilities. I bought the third mortgage on the suburban family home. I bought the deeds to the commercial warehouse district. I bought the paper on Malik's outdated trucking fleet. I bought the high-interest hard money loans funding Chad's fraudulent development projects. I purchased your entire existence for pennies on the dollar through my shell corporation." Beverly gasped loudly. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching her pearl necklace as if it could protect her from the truth. She looked at Elijah, panic finally breaking through her meticulously maintained country club facade. "What does she mean?" Elijah Beverly demanded, her voice trembling with hysteria. "Tell me what she means right now." Elijah could not answer her. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle spasmed violently in his cheek. He was staring at the screen, the crushing weight of his monumental failure paralyzing his tongue. The patriarch who had demanded my submission, who had ordered me to respect his authority, was completely broken. He had handed the keys to his kingdom over to a white son-in-law who had promptly driven them all off a financial cliff. And now, the only person standing at the bottom to catch them was the daughter he had declared dead. Malik let out a low, ragged breath. He physically slumped into his chair, dropping his head into his trembling hands. The tailored suit he wore to intimidate me suddenly looked like a cheap, oversized costume. The golden child identity he had worn his entire life dissolved into nothing. "You are Apex Holdings," Malik whispered to the floor, his voice completely hollow and defeated. "You are the private institution we have been paying all this time. You are the lender who refused to extend our terms. I did not just survive after you discarded me," I told him, looking down at the top of his head. "I became the very institution you are currently begging for mercy. When you were ignoring my existence, I was reviewing your profit and loss statements. When you were bragging online about your brand new luxury vehicles, I was authorizing your default notices. I did not need to spy on your bank accounts, Malik, because those accounts legally belong to me." I turned my attention away from my brother and stepped right in front of Chad. He refused to look me in the eye. He was staring down at the mahogany wood, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The confidence he had weaponized against me in the lobby was entirely gone. "You walked into my building and demanded a $3 million bridge loan," I said. letting the cold mockery drip from every single syllable. You stood in my boardroom and told me that I needed your strong hand to guide my investments. You assumed that because I am a black woman, I must have stumbled into this wealth by accident, or relied on a wealthy man to fund my life. You thought you could bully a lucky girl into financing your rescue operation so you could play the savior for my parents. Chad clenched his fists at his sides, but he did not speak. The fragile foundation of his superiority had been pulverized. But you did not walk into a family meeting today, Chad. I promised him, leaning in slightly so he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. You walked directly into the jaws of your primary creditor. You are not pitching a business partnership. You are standing in front of the woman who legally owns your homes, your businesses, and your entire financial future. You do not have a family equity safety net anymore. You just have me. Chad threw his entire body weight across the custom mahogany table. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. He lunged with his arms outstretched, his hands aiming directly for my throat. He genuinely believed that physical violence could reverse a legal foreclosure. He thought his sheer aggression would force me to cower. He did not even make it halfway across the wood. Before his fingertips could brush the fabric of my linen blazer, Jackson moved. My head of security crossed the room with terrifying, lethal speed. There was no hesitation and no warning. Jackson grabbed Chad by the back of his collar and the shoulder of his poorly tailored suit jacket. With a single fluid motion born from years of military police training, Jackson halted Chad in mid-air and slammed him face first into the thick glass wall of the boardroom. The impact echoed with a sickening thud that silenced every other sound in the room. Chad let out a sharp groan as all the air was forcefully expelled from his lungs. Jackson smoothly swept Chad's arms behind his back, applying just enough upward pressure to lock him completely in place. "Do not move a single muscle," Jackson commanded. His voice was deadly calm, lacking any anger, which somehow made the order even more terrifying. Shanice let out a piercing shriek. She scrambled backward, pressing her back against the nearest window, her hands covering her mouth in absolute horror. She wanted to scream at Jackson to let her husband go, but the reality of the armed security detail finally registered in her mind. She was paralyzed. Elijah instinctively took a half step forward, his jaw tight, his protective instincts kicking in. But the second security guard simply stepped into Elijah's path and leveled a cold, unblinking stare at my father. Elijah froze instantly. The patriarch who had spent 30 years ruling our family through intimidation was entirely neutralized by a single look. I did not flinch. My heart rate did not elevate. I simply stood at the head of the table and adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I looked at Chad, whose cheek was currently pressed flat against the soundproof glass, his breath fogging up the transparent surface. The arrogant real estate flipper, who had demanded my submission, was entirely stripped of his power, restrained like a common trespasser. I reached into my leather portfolio. I pulled out a thick stack of crisp, legally binding documents. They were heavy stamped with the official seal of my legal counsel and notarized for immediate execution. I placed my hand flat on top of the stack and pushed it firmly. The papers slid perfectly down the center of the polished mahogany table, coming to a stop directly in front of where Elijah was standing. "I told you that you were in absolute breach of contract," I announced, my voice carrying clear and absolute authority across the room. "You bypassed the 90-day cure period because you were too arrogant to realize you were bleeding out. You thought you could ignore the default notices. You thought your private institutional lender was just a faceless bank that would eventually negotiate. You were wrong. I am calling the entire principal balance due immediately. Those papers are the formal notices of debt acceleration and immediate foreclosure." Malik stared at the documents like they were radioactive. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes tracking the bold, black text visible on the top page. It was his corporate guarantee. "What does that mean?" Beverly whimpered from her position on the floor. She had stopped crawling toward me, her tear-streaked face looking up in desperate confusion. "Imani, what do those papers mean?" "Do those papers?" "It means you no longer own your life, Beverly," I answered, looking down at her. It means that on Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the legal eviction proceedings will commence. County sheriff deputies will arrive at your sprawling suburban home. They will post the physical foreclosure notices on your front door, and they will give you a legally mandated window to vacate the premises before the locks are changed. You will not have the luxury of hosting your country club friends or pretending you are wealthy anymore. Your house belongs to Apex Holdings. It belongs to me. I shifted my gaze to Malik, who was gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. At that exact same hour, on Monday morning, commercial towing companies will arrive at your primary logistics warehouse. They have authorization to seize your entire fleet of trucks to satisfy the accelerated corporate debt. Your warehouse lease will be terminated due to your delinquent status. Your employees will finally learn that their CEO drained the operating accounts to buy designer suits and luxury cars. You have zero operational infrastructure left. Finally, I looked at Chad. He was still pinned against the glass, straining his neck to glare at me, his eyes burning with humiliated fury. And as for your high-yield real estate portfolio, Chad, I continued, my tone dripping with absolute clinical detachment. The hard money loans you took out have officially defaulted. My legal team has already filed the paperwork to freeze your holding accounts. The properties you plan to flip are now legally under my control. You cannot pull permits. You cannot pay your contractors. You cannot sell a single brick. Your entire business model is completely liquidated. You walked in here trying to teach me a lesson about building generational wealth, and I just legally repossessed every single asset you thought you controlled. Elijah picked up the top document with trembling hands. The paper shook wildly as he read the undeniable legal reality of his ruin. The signature at the bottom, the corporate seals the exact dollar amounts of their consolidated debt. It was all there. It was bulletproof. There was no loophole, no negotiation tactic, and no amount of booming patriarchal shouting that could reverse the signatures he had willingly provided to my shell corporation months ago. Imani, you have to stop this, Elijah pleaded. His voice broke, shattering into a hoarse, desperate rasp. You have made your point. You proved that you are successful. You proved that we were wrong. But you cannot execute these documents. If you do this, we have absolutely nowhere to go. We will be bankrupt. We will lose everything we spent our entire lives building. I stared at him, feeling the absolute clarity of a woman who had finally excised the poison from her life. You did not build anything, Elijah. You borrowed money to create an illusion, and you used your hatred of me to bond your fake family together. You threw me out into the rain and told me I was dead. I am just honoring the funeral arrangements. I tapped the surface of the mahogany table twice, signaling that the conversation was entirely concluded. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate my building, I announced. I looked at the digital clock displayed on the boardroom wall. The red numbers glared brightly in the silent room. You can take the private elevator down to the lobby, walk out the front doors, and drive your heavily financed vehicles back to the houses you no longer own. You can leave with whatever tiny shred of dignity you think you have left. I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify my next words. But if you are still standing on this floor when that clock hits exactly 9:15, Jackson will not just escort you out. He will place Chad under citizen's arrest for attempted assault. He will call the Atlanta Police Department, and every single one of you will be dragged out of my corporate headquarters in handcuffs while my entire staff watches. I looked at Jackson and gave a sharp, subtle nod. Jackson immediately released his grip on Chad, stepping back, but keeping his hands ready. Chad stumbled away from the glass, rubbing his shoulder, his chest heaving. He opened his mouth, desperate to hurl one last insult, one last racial or misogynistic slur, to soothe his bruised ego. But one look at the cold, unblinking stare of my security detail silenced him completely. The timer is running, I said softly. Shanice grabbed Chad by the arm, sobbing openly, now pulling him toward the elevator doors. Malik stood up on shaking legs, completely abandoning the faux leather chair. He did not look at me. He just put his head down and walked toward the exit like a condemned man. Elijah reached down and hauled Beverly up from the carpet. She was a messy, weeping shell of the woman who had demanded my routing numbers just an hour ago. They shuffled towards the glass elevator, a defeated, broken line of people who had flown too close to a sun they thought they could control. I did not watch them leave. I turned my back to them, picked up my tablet, and began reviewing my shipping manifests. I had a flight to catch a yacht waiting in Miami and a global empire to run. The Taylor family was officially closed for business. I turned my back on them. I did not offer a lingering glance of pity, nor did I wait to see if the reality of their financial execution would wring one final desperate apology from their lips. The heavy polished mahogany table now served as an insurmountable barricade between the life I had painstakingly built and the parasitic hierarchy they had tried to maintain. The crisp, legally binding notices of debt acceleration resting in front of Elijah were the only response they would ever receive from me again. I walked away, the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the floor cutting through the thick, pressurized silence of the penthouse boardroom. Behind me, Jackson and the armed security team seamlessly closed ranks, forming an impenetrable human wall. They stood with military precision, their expressions entirely devoid of sympathy, ensuring that not a single member of my family could take so much as a half step in my direction. I did not need to look over my shoulder to know exactly what I was leaving behind. I could feel the absolute crushing weight of their devastation. Chad was still breathing heavily against the soundproof glass, humiliated and neutralized. Beverly was a crumpled, sobbing mess on my premium carpet. Malik was completely paralyzed by the realization that his outdated corporate logistics firm was dead. And Elijah, the booming patriarch who had thrown my only suitcase into a muddy puddle 5 years ago, was staring down at the paperwork that officially evicted him from his own fabricated kingdom. I reached the frosted glass doors of my private executive elevator. They slid open silently, anticipating my arrival. I stepped inside the pristine glass carriage, turning around just as the doors began to seal shut. For one brief cinematic fraction of a second, I looked through the narrowing gap. I saw the 5 of them trapped in the opulent cage of my boardroom, surrounded by the undeniable proof of my supremacy. Then the doors clicked together, locking them out of my world forever. The descent was smooth and soundless. As the elevator glided downward through the architectural core of my headquarters, the sprawling, sunlit Atlanta skyline unfolded through the transparent walls. I watched the city stretch out in a brilliant grid of glass, steel, and concrete. 5 years ago, I was navigating those exact streets with $90 to my name, shivering in a thin jacket, terrified of what the morning would bring. My parents had convinced me that the world was a brutal, unforgiving place for a black woman who refused to follow the rules, and that without their protection, I would be swallowed whole. They were wrong. I was not swallowed by the world. I conquered it. I built the infrastructure that kept those streets moving. I financed the concrete. I owned the horizon. As the carriage passed the midpoint of the high-rise, a sudden frantic vibration erupted in the pocket of my tailored linen blazer. The buzzing was erratic and continuous, the digital manifestation of pure panic. I reached in and pulled out my phone. The screen was completely illuminated, flooded with a rapid-fire barrage of incoming notifications. It was the Taylor family group chat. The same digital thread that had been a toxic echo chamber of entitlement and defamation just 48 hours ago was now mutating into a desperate, groveling scramble for survival. Aunt Cheryl was leading the charge. The loudest gossip in the family, the woman who had proudly gone live on social media from a Miami hotel cafe to paint me as a greedy yacht-hoarding villain, had suddenly realized the catastrophic consequences of her viral stunt. Her messages poured in, each one more frantic and hyper-religious than the last. "Imani, sweetheart, please answer the phone." Cheryl typed her message, followed by a string of praying hands emojis. "The devil was working through me yesterday. I was confused and led astray. I did not mean to start a war in this family. Your father just called me crying. Please, baby girl, do not take their house. We are a village. We have to pray on this. The Lord teaches us forgiveness. Let Auntie Cheryl come up to Atlanta, and we can sit down and break bread." I watched the text bubbles multiply. Cousin Tyrell, who had called me a sellout for not funding his non-existent rap career, was suddenly deleting his previous insults and typing out clumsy apologies about how he always knew I was a boss. Uncle Vernon was sending voice notes that I did not even bother to transcribe. The entire extended family had just received the shockwave of the boardroom execution. Elijah must have frantically dialed his sister the second I stepped into the elevator, crying about the foreclosure notices. They finally understood that the girl they had mocked and abandoned was not just wealthy. She was ruthless, she was legally fortified, and she held the absolute power to dismantle their lives with the stroke of a pen. They thought they could invoke God and family unity to reverse a legally binding debt acceleration. They thought the same toxic community that had cheered for my downfall would somehow shame me into offering clemency. I stared at the screen, feeling nothing but a profound, beautifully hollow calm. There was no anger left in my system. There was no residual hurt, no lingering desire for their validation, and absolutely no urge to explain my actions. Arguing with them would only validate their delusion that they still deserved access to my energy. I tapped the screen with my thumb. I did not type a single letter of response. I did not defend my honor or offer a warning. I navigated directly to Aunt Cheryl's contact profile. With one swift clinical motion, I pressed block. I backed out to the main messaging menu and hovered over the Taylor family group chat. A thread containing 3 decades of conditional love, passive-aggressive manipulation, and outright betrayal. I swiped left. I pressed delete and leave group. A prompt popped up on the screen, asking me to confirm the permanent deletion of the conversation. I tapped confirm. The chat vanished. The digital cord was cut. The silence that washed over my phone was absolute and pure. They were gone. The elevator glided to a gentle halt. The doors parted, revealing the dimly lit, highly secure underground parking garage of my corporate headquarters. The air down here was cool and smelled faintly of expensive tire rubber and polished concrete. My private security detail stationed at the garage entrance nodded respectfully as I stepped out of the carriage. Waiting idle just a few yards away was my chauffeured vehicle, a sleek custom-armored black SUV with heavily tinted windows. My driver, David, stood at attention by the rear passenger door. His posture was impeccable, his dark suit immaculate. He did not ask about the commotion upstairs. He simply opened the heavy armored door, offering me a polite deferential nod. "Good afternoon, Ms. Taylor," David said smoothly. "Good afternoon, David," I replied, sliding into the cavernous leather-appointed interior of the back seat. The cabin was a sanctuary of climate-controlled perfection, completely insulated from the noise and chaos of the outside world. David closed the door with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing me inside. He walked around the front of the vehicle and slid into the driver's seat, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "To the airport, David," I instructed, leaning back against the plush leather headrest and closing my eyes for a brief, incredibly peaceful moment. The engine purred to life, a low, powerful vibration that resonated through the chassis. The SUV glided smoothly out of the parking bay, ascending the concrete ramp toward the bright, sunlit streets of Atlanta. I looked out the tinted window as the city rolled past. I was leaving this city behind, and with it the ghosts of the people who had tried to bury me in its soil. The paperwork was signed, the legal mechanisms were already in motion. On Monday morning at 8 o'clock, the county sheriffs and the commercial towing companies would arrive at the suburban home, the failing real estate properties, and the logistics warehouses. The eviction of their toxic legacy was absolute. My private jet was already prepped and waiting on the tarmac. A short flight south, and I would be back where this entire chaotic chapter had begun. The Sovereign was waiting for me docked in the pristine turquoise waters of Miami. The ocean was calling, massive, untamed, and perfectly clear. The debt was paid in full. The past was entirely foreclosed. I took a deep, unrestricted breath of the cool, conditioned air, feeling a radiant warmth spread through my chest. For the first time in 35 years, I was completely, unapologetically, and beautifully free. The greatest lesson I learned from foreclosing on my past is that blood does not automatically grant someone access to your future. For years, I allowed my family to dictate my worth, shrinking myself to fit their toxic narrative. But true power comes from walking away from tables where respect is no longer being served. You do not owe your success to the people who abandoned you during your deepest struggles. Forgiveness does not mean funding their failures or tolerating their abuse. When you finally stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you, you build an empire they can never touch. If you have ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below. And do not forget to hit like and subscribe for more journeys of reclaiming your power.